Tom Brennan sat in his 1998 Ford F-250 outside the lawyer's office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, on a Tuesday morning in March 2023 that felt like the end of everything. The sky was the color of old concrete, and a wind that tasted like dust and diesel rattled the passenger side mirror he'd been meaning to tighten for 3 years. He was 58 years old. His wife Sarah had been dead for 6 months. And he had $38,000 in a checking account that represented everything he owned in the world. The math of loss was simple when you finally stopped lying to yourself about it. Hospital bills from Sarah's last 2 weeks, when the stroke left her unable to speak or recognize him, had consumed $41,000. The funeral, because she'd wanted something dignified with flowers that didn't look cheap, another $6,000. The house they'd owned for 22 years, the one with the kitchen she'd remodeled herself and the garden where she'd grown tomatoes that actually tasted like something, sold for $212,000. After the mortgage payoff and the realtor's cut and the repairs the inspector demanded, Tom walked away with $85,000. Subtract the medical debt and funeral costs, and what remained was $38,000 and the truck he was sitting in, which had 173,000 miles on the odometer, and a check engine light that had been glowing amber for the last 2 states. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Cole, his son, calling from Palo Alto for the third time that morning. Tom watched it vibrate against the cracked leather until it went silent. Cole was 24 years old, finishing his MBA at Stanford, living in a world of pitch decks and term sheets and venture capital that Tom didn't understand and didn't particularly want to. They'd spoken at Sarah's funeral, standing beside the grave in suits that felt like costumes, and Cole had said all the right things about coming home to help, about taking time off, about being there for his father. Tom had told him not to be stupid, that a Stanford MBA didn't pause for grief, that Sarah would have wanted him to finish what he started. They both knew it was permission to stay away, and they both took it. The truck's heater wheezed warm air that smelled faintly of antifreeze. Tom had been living in motel rooms for 3 weeks, ever since the house closed escrow and the new owners took possession. $85 a night at the kind of places that rented by the week and didn't ask questions about the bottle in your luggage. He'd stopped counting days, started counting money instead. 38,000 minus 3 weeks of motels minus food minus gas, minus the bottle of Jim Beam he bought every third day because that felt like moderation. The number shrank in ways that felt inevitable, like watching blood leak from a wound you couldn't quite reach to staunch. He'd been scrolling through apartment listings on his phone at 2 in the morning 3 days ago, the particular hour when desperation turned into something darker and more honest. Studio apartments in Cheyenne wanted first month, last month, security deposit. That was $4,800 before you turned on a light or flushed a toilet. One-bedroom places wanted more. The cheaper options came with neighbors who sold methamphetamine or played bass at volumes that suggested profound hearing loss. And even those wanted money Tom didn't have once he factored in utilities and the basic cost of continuing to exist in a world that charged rent for the privilege. That was when he'd found the foreclosure listings. He didn't remember deciding to look at them. His thumb just kept scrolling, past the apartments he couldn't afford and the rooms for rent that came with curfews, until he was looking at properties that banks had taken from people who'd run out of options. Most of them were in towns he'd never heard of, priced at numbers that seemed like typing errors. He'd been about to close the browser when he saw it. Peterson Ranch, 160 acres, Powder River Basin, Wyoming. House, barn, equipment shed, livestock facilities. Minimum bid $35,000, listed for 11 months. 0 bids received. The photographs were the kind real estate agents took when they'd stopped caring whether anyone bought the property. Drone shots showed a landscape of high prairie grass and fence posts that leaned like drunk men trying to hold each other up. The house was a two-story farmhouse with white paint that had peeled down to gray wooden sheets, and a front porch that had collapsed on one end, leaving the roof angled like a broken jaw. The barn was worse. It leaned to the south at an angle that made Tom wonder if it was still technically standing or had just paused in the middle of falling. Behind it, a grain silo stood with a jagged hole in the side where lightning had punched through, and next to that, an equipment shed with a roof that sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. The listing included 16 photographs. Tom looked at all of them twice. In the last image, barely visible through the open door of the equipment shed, sat what looked like a tractor. The angle was wrong and the light was dim, but Tom could make out the general shape. Old, small, covered in dust thick enough to see in a photograph. The caption below read, "Equipment included in sale. 1954 Alley's Chalmers WD tractor, condition unknown, has not run since 2015. Tom stared at that last photograph for 20 minutes. He couldn't have explained why if someone had asked. The tractor was just a shape in shadows, a piece of farm equipment that hadn't worked in 8 years sitting in a shed on property nobody wanted. But something about it caught in his chest and wouldn't let go. When he was 10 years old, his grandfather had let him sit on an Alley's Chalmers tractor, an old orange machine that smelled like diesel and hot metal and cut grass. His grandfather, James Brennan, had served in Korea and come home to buy a ranch in Wyoming with money saved from 4 years of combat pay. Tom remembered sitting on that tractor seat, feet dangling a foot off the running board, while his grandfather showed him how to work the clutch and throttle. That was 48 years ago, before Tom joined the Army himself, before Gulf War deployments and tank maintenance, and coming home to find that his grandfather had died while he was overseas. The ranch had been sold, his mother told him. Some bank thing, details she didn't want to discuss. Tom saved the listing. Then he opened it again, read every word, studied every photograph. At 4 in the morning, he sent an email to the bank that held the property asking to schedule a viewing. At 6, before the Jim beam wore off enough to let doubt creep back in, he sent another email stating his intent to bid at the auction scheduled for April 5th. Now it was April 5th, and Tom was sitting outside a lawyer's office with a cashier's check for $38,200 in the envelope beside him. And the reality of what he was about to do felt like standing at the door of an airplane at 12,000 feet being told to jump. The auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the Johnson County Courthouse in Buffalo, Wyoming. Tom had driven up from Cheyenne the night before, another $85 at another motel that smelled like cigarettes and resignation. He'd barely slept, kept running numbers in his head. The minimum bid was $35,000. County records showed back taxes of $2,800 due. Closing costs would add another $400 minimum. That put the total at $38,200, exactly what he had. No room for error, no buffer, no plan B. He started the truck and drove the 8 blocks to the courthouse. The building was red brick and white columns, the kind of civic architecture that was supposed to inspire confidence in the American judicial system. Tom parked in a lot that was mostly empty and sat with the engine running, watching steam rise from a coffee shop across the street where normal people were buying lattes and starting their normal days. He could still leave, drive back to Cheyenne, find an apartment, get a job doing something. Tank mechanics translated to diesel repair, probably. 60-hour weeks at some shop that serviced commercial trucks, coming home smelling like grease and solvent, saving money that would never quite be enough for anything that mattered. He turned off the engine, grabbed the envelope, got out before the voice in his head that sounded like Sarah's common sense could tell him this was the worst decision he'd made since enlisting at 18 to escape a town that felt too small to contain whatever it was he thought he wanted from life. The auction room was on the second floor, a space with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that hummed with the particular frequency that promised headaches. Folding chairs arranged in rows faced a podium where a woman in a county clerk's uniform was organizing paperwork. Tom counted the chairs, 36 of them, all empty except for his. The auctioneer arrived at 9:50, a man in his 60s wearing a bolo tie and a sports jacket that had been stylish during the Carter administration. He looked at Tom sitting alone in the third row, and something that might have been sympathy crossed his face before professionalism replaced it. They started exactly at 10 o'clock. The auctioneer read from a prepared statement outlining the property details, the minimum bid, the terms of sale. His voice had the practiced cadence of someone who'd done this too many times, selling off pieces of other people's failed dreams to crowds that never showed up. When he finished, he looked at Tom and asked if he was there to bid on Peterson Ranch. Tom said yes. The auctioneer nodded and called for opening bids at $35,000. Tom raised his hand. The motion felt surreal, like watching someone else's arm lift in slow motion. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid, then waited the required interval in case someone else materialized from the empty chairs. 30 seconds of silence followed. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The fluorescent lights hummed. Going once at $35,000. More silence. Tom could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Going twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sound like a small bone breaking. Sold to bidder number 1 for $35,000. Tom sat there feeling nothing and everything at once. The county clerk approached with paperwork. The auctioneer packed his notes. Tom signed documents he barely read, each signature feeling like a step further from shore into water too deep to see the bottom. The back taxes were $2,800, due immediately. Closing costs came to $475. The clerk calculated the total on a desktop calculator that was probably older than Tom's truck. $38,275. Tom pulled the cashier's check from the envelope. $38,200. He was $75 short. The clerk looked at the check, then at Tom, then back at the check. She had the weathered face of someone who'd worked in county government long enough to have seen every variation of human desperation walk through that door. She picked up a phone, spoke quietly to someone Tom couldn't see, then hung up and made a note on the paperwork. "We'll waive the recording fee. That brings it to $38,200 even." Tom stared at her. The kindness felt like it might break something in his chest if he acknowledged it directly. "Thank you," he managed. "You're the first person to bid on that property in 11 months. Most folks took one look at the photographs and kept driving. What made you stop?" Tom didn't have an answer that made sense. He handed her the check and watched her stamp it received, official, irreversible. She gave him a packet of documents including the deed, the title transfer, the disclosure statements he should have read before the auction but hadn't. He took them and walked out into April sunshine that felt too bright for what had just happened. In the truck, he opened the deed and read his own name typed in official county font. Thomas James Brennan, owner of 160 acres in Powder River Basin, Wyoming, plus all structures and improvements thereon. He was property rich and cash poor, a phrase his grandfather used to use when talking about ranching. Tom had $0 in his checking account. No income. No plan beyond the vague notion that he'd figure something out, because the alternative was admitting he just made a catastrophic mistake. He drove north on Highway 196, following directions he'd memorized from the listing. 37 miles out of Buffalo, the landscape opened into high prairie country, where the horizon stretched so far it looked curved. Grass the color of old straw bent under wind that never seemed to stop. Fence lines marked property boundaries in ruler straight rows, and every 10 miles or so, a ranch house sat surrounded by outbuildings and equipment that looked small against all that open sky. The turnoff to Peterson Ranch was marked by a mailbox hanging sideways on a post that had rotted through at ground level. A gravel driveway, more holes than gravel, wound through a shallow valley between hills covered in sage brush. Tom followed it for half a mile before the buildings came into view. The photographs hadn't lied, but they'd been generous. The house looked worse in person. The collapsed porch had taken part of the roof overhang with it, leaving exposed rafters that had weathered to the color of bone. Windows on the first floor were intact but filmed with dirt thick enough to obscure whatever was inside. The second floor showed broken glass in 2 windows, and the hole in the roof was larger than the photograph suggested, easily 6 feet across, opening directly into what must have been a bedroom. The barn leaned at an angle that seemed to defy basic engineering. Tom parked the truck and got out, walking slowly toward it, watching for movement that would suggest imminent collapse. Up close, he could see that the foundation on the south side had settled, dropping that entire wall by nearly 3 feet. The structure had twisted as it sank, torquing the frame until boards pulled apart and nails worked loose. It was still standing, technically, but Tom gave it even odds of surviving the next serious windstorm. Behind the barn, the grain silo wore its lightning scar like a war wound, a jagged tear in metal panels that had rusted around the edges until the whole looked organic, like something that had grown rather than been punched through by electricity. Tom circled the property, taking inventory. A chicken coop with no chickens, a windmill missing half its blades, fence posts connected by wire that had rusted through in enough places that any livestock would have walked off years ago. In the middle distance, a stock pond sat dried to cracked mud, and beyond that, 160 acres of grass and sage and not much else. The equipment shed stood nearest to the house, a simple structure with walls of corrugated metal and a roof that sagged in the middle but appeared mostly intact. The door hung open on hinges that had frozen in place. Tom stepped inside and waited for his eyes to adjust to the dimness. Light filtered through gaps in the wall panels, creating bars of illumination that showed dust hanging in the air like fog. The shed smelled like motor oil and rust and old hay and bird droppings. Along the walls, hand tools hung from nails or lay scattered on a workbench that hadn't been disturbed in years. In the center of the space, covered in dust thick enough to write your name in, sat the tractor. Tom had expected something worse, something completely cannibalized or rusted beyond recognition. What he found instead was a machine that looked like it had simply been parked one day and forgotten. The 1954 Alley's Chalmers WD sat on 4 flat tires, its orange paint faded to a color somewhere between rust and old clay. Dust covered every surface, and bird nests filled the spaces between the engine and the hood, but the tractor appeared structurally intact. All the parts seemed to be there. The seat was cracked leather over springs that had lost their padding. The steering wheel showed smooth spots where hands had gripped it for decades. One headlight was intact. The exhaust stack had rusted through at the base, but the damage looked superficial. Tom circled the tractor slowly. He'd worked on similar machines in the Army before they'd transitioned fully to diesel equipment. These old gasoline-powered tractors were simple by design. Magneto ignition, gravity-fed fuel system, mechanical governor, everything visible and accessible, everything fixable if you had patience and the right parts and enough time to figure out what was broken. He reached out and touched the hood, wiping away enough dust to reveal a strip of original orange paint. The metal was cold and solid under his palm. Something about the physical reality of it, the weight and permanence, made his chest tighten. This machine had been built in 1954, the year his grandfather came home from Korea. It had worked for 61 years before someone parked it and walked away. 8 years of sitting idle, dust and bird nests and flat tires. But the frame wasn't rusted through. The engine blocks showed no visible cracks. The wheels turned when he pushed against them, squealing on axles that hadn't moved in nearly a decade. Tom sat down on the tractor seat. The springs groaned and the leather cracked further under his weight, but it held. He put his hands on the steering wheel where countless other hands had gripped it, and for a moment he let himself imagine actually making this thing work again. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. He was 58 years old. He had $0, no mechanical expertise beyond basic maintenance, no tools, no parts, no idea what he was doing. And he just bought a ranch he couldn't afford with a house he couldn't live in, and a tractor that hadn't run since Obama's second term. That's when he noticed the leather was loose on one side of the seat, not just cracked, actually separating from the springs beneath. He prodded it with his finger and felt something shift underneath. There was a space there between the seat cushion and the base, deliberately created, a hiding spot or storage compartment. Tom worked his fingers into the gap and felt something hard and flat. He pulled it free carefully, years of dust and bird droppings cascading onto his jeans. It was a journal, bound in leather that had been good quality once and was now dried and cracked with age. The cover was stained with what looked like oil or grease or both, and the pages were yellowed at the edges. Tom opened it carefully. The first page showed handwriting in blue ink that had faded but was still legible. Property of CPL. James R. Brennan, USMC, 2nd Infantry Division, Korea 1950 to 1953. Tom stopped breathing. The handwriting blurred and then sharpened. James R. Brennan, his grandfather, the man who'd let him sit on an Alley's Chalmers tractor when he was 10 years old. The man who died in 1985 while Tom was deployed during his first Army assignment. The man whose ranch had been sold, his mother said, because of some bank thing she didn't want to explain. Tom turned the page with hands that had started shaking. The journal entries were dated, starting in April 1953. The first one was short. Came home from Korea today. 26 months of frozen ground and Chinese artillery and watching Marines die for hills we gave back the next week. Don't know how to be a civilian again. Don't know how to be anything except scared and angry and trying not to show it. Tom read the entry 3 times. The words could have been his own, written after the Gulf War when he'd come home from tank maintenance duty in desert heat and adrenaline, and the particular terror of waiting for incoming rounds. His grandfather had felt the same thing, had written it down in this journal and hidden it in a tractor seat because maybe that was the only place where the truth felt safe. The next entries tracked his grandfather's first months home, working construction jobs that didn't last, drinking too much, fighting with his father about wasting his life. Then, in October 1953, a longer entry. Bought 160 acres today in Wyoming, Powder River Basin country. So far from anywhere I can't hear traffic or sirens or voices telling me what to do. Cost me $8,000, every cent I saved from combat pay. Dad said I'm throwing my life away on land that won't grow anything but sagebrush and regret. Maybe he's right, but it's mine. Nobody can take it from me. Nobody can tell me when to wake up or when to sleep or when to be afraid. That's worth $8,000. Tom felt something crack open in his chest. This ranch, the one he just bought at auction for $38,000 because he was desperate and had nowhere else to go, was the same ranch his grandfather had bought in 1953 for the exact same reason. The same land, the same buildings, or what remained of them after 70 years. The same desperate need for something that belonged to you and you alone. He kept reading. The entries tracked his grandfather's first years building the ranch, learning to farm by trial and error, losing crops to drought and hail, fighting with banks over loan payments, meeting a woman named Claire who became Tom's grandmother, having children, building a life one season at a time. In April 1954, an entry about the tractor. Bought an Alley's Chalmers WD today. Brand new, right off the dealer lot. Painted bright orange like a traffic cone. Cost $1,400 I didn't have. Took a loan from Farmers Bank at 8% interest. Dad heard about it and called me a fool. Said tractors are for rich men and I'm just playing at being a rancher. Maybe so. But this machine is the first thing I've owned since Korea that wasn't trying to kill me. She'll pull a plow or a disc or whatever else I ask, and she won't complain and she won't break down if I take care of her right. That's more than most people give you. Tom closed his eyes. He was sitting on the same tractor his grandfather had bought brand new 70 years ago. The same machine that had worked this land for 6 decades. The orange paint had faded and the engine had seized and the tires had gone flat, but the frame was still solid. The bones were good. Everything else could be fixed. The journal entries continued through the 1950s and 1960s. His grandfather wrote about droughts and good harvests and the price of cattle. He wrote about Tom's mother being born, and later about Tom himself. There was an entry from 1975 when Tom was 10 years old. My grandson Tom visited today. Sarah's boy, smart as a whip and curious about everything. I let him sit on the alleys and showed him how the controls work. He asked 1,000 questions and listened to every answer like it mattered. Kid's got something in him. Persistence maybe, or stubbornness. Either way, he reminds me of myself at that age, before Korea taught me what the world really thinks of stubborn men with ideas about independence. Tom had to stop reading. The memory came back in pieces he'd forgotten or chosen not to remember. Summer of 1975. His mother dropping him at the ranch for a week while she dealt with something Tom was too young to understand. His grandfather showing him around, letting him help with chores that probably made more work than they saved. That tractor ride. Sitting on the seat with his grandfather's hand steadying him, while the engine rumbled beneath them, and the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with cut grass and dust. He forced himself to keep reading. The entries grew more sporadic through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Mentions of money troubles, bank loans coming due, the price of cattle dropping. In 1984, an entry that made Tom's hands shake. Bank called today. I'm 3 months behind on the note. They want $18,000 by end of year or they foreclose. I don't have $18,000. I don't have $1,800. I've worked this land for 31 years and built something from nothing, and they're going to take it because some lone officer in Denver decided the numbers don't work. Tom's deployed overseas now, Army tank mechanic, making me proud even if I never told him that enough. He's supposed to come home and inherit this place. Instead, I'm going to hand him nothing but the news that his grandfather failed. The next entry was dated March 1985. Bank took the ranch today. Gave me 60 days to clear out. Furniture, tools, personal effects. The alley stays because it's secured against the note. Couldn't bring myself to tell Claire how bad it got. Couldn't bring myself to tell Tom. He's still overseas and I'll probably be dead before he gets back. Heart's been giving out for months now. Doctor says 6 months maybe. I'm not telling anyone that either. I'll pack what matters and move to that apartment in town Claire found. And I'll pretend the last 30 years didn't end with me signing away everything I built. The final entry was dated April 1985, written in handwriting that shook badly enough to be barely legible. Hid this journal in the tractor seat today. Last time I'll sit here. Last time I'll touch something I actually owned instead of just borrowed from the bank. If you're reading this, you found what I left. You probably bought this place at auction after whoever bought it from the bank gave up too. That's how it works. Land changes hands. Men build things and other men take them over when the first ones fail or die or just run out of luck. If you're family, if you're Tom or one of his kids, then listen. I didn't give up. They took it from me. There's a difference. I worked this land for 31 years and I'd have worked it 30 more if they'd let me. The Alley's is old, but she's sound. Treat her right and she'll outlast both of us. Fix her if she's broken. That's what men like us do. We fix things that other people give up on. Tom sat on the tractor seat in the dusty equipment shed and cried for the first time since Sarah's funeral. He cried for his grandfather who'd lost this ranch to a bank in 1985. He cried for himself, 58 years old, and sitting on the same land his grandfather had been forced to abandon. He cried because the cycle had somehow completed itself. Because 38 years after foreclosure, this ranch had cycled through enough failed owners to end up back in Brennan hands. And he didn't know if that was redemption or just another kind of failure waiting to happen. When he finally stopped, the sun had moved enough that the bars of light coming through the wall gaps hit different parts of the shed. He wiped his face on his sleeve and looked around at the wreckage he'd just bought. The house with the hole in the roof. The barn that physics suggested should have fallen over years ago. The tractor that hadn't run since 2015. 160 acres of grass and sage brush, and the accumulated failures of everyone who'd tried and quit before him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Cole calling again. Tom pulled it out and looked at his son's name on the screen. He should answer, should tell Cole what he'd done, should ask for advice or money or just someone to confirm that buying a ruined ranch with his last dollar made any kind of sense at all. Instead, he put the phone back in his pocket and let it buzz until it went silent. Then he stood up from the tractor seat, carefully placing the journal on the workbench where it wouldn't get damaged. He walked out of the equipment shed and across the yard to the house. The front door was unlocked, swollen in its frame but yielding when he put his shoulder against it. Inside, the house smelled like closed spaces and mouse droppings and decades of other people's lives. Plaster had fallen from the ceiling in chunks. The kitchen sink was rust-stained, and when Tom tried the faucet, nothing came out but a groan deep in the pipes. The bathroom toilet had a crack in the tank. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms opened off a narrow hallway. The hole in the roof dominated the largest bedroom, and Tom could see straight through to gray April sky. He chose the smallest bedroom, the one in the back with an intact ceiling and a door that still closed. The floor was dusty but solid. There was an old metal bed frame with no mattress, a dresser with 2 drawers missing, and nothing else. Tom went back to his truck and pulled out the sleeping bag and camping gear he'd been carrying since he checked out of the last motel. He spread the sleeping bag on the floor, arranged his few possessions in a corner, and sat down with his back against the wall. Through the window he could see the equipment shed where his grandfather's tractor sat waiting. The sun was setting, turning the sky the color of a healing bruise. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. The wind moved through the eaves of the house making sounds like breathing. Tom had nowhere to go. No money. No plan. No idea how to make any of this work. But it was his. The land was his. The broken buildings were his. The tractor that hadn't run in 8 years was his. And his grandfather's voice, preserved in ink on yellowed pages, had reached across 38 years to tell him that failing wasn't the same as being beaten. That fixing broken things was what men like them did. That persistence mattered more than luck. Tom pulled out his phone. The battery was at 15%. He typed a message to Cole. Bought a ranch in Wyoming. It needs work. Come when you can. He hit send before doubt could stop him. Then he put the phone on airplane mode to save the battery, stretched out on the sleeping bag, and stared at the ceiling until darkness filled the room and exhaustion finally pulled him under. Tomorrow he would figure out how to start fixing things. Tonight, he just needed to survive being alone with what he'd done. Tom woke on the floor of the back bedroom to sunlight coming through a window so dirty it turned dawn the color of amber. His back had locked up during the night. 58 years of accumulated damage from tank hatches and loading ramps and sleeping on surfaces that weren't designed for human spines. He rolled onto his side and pushed himself to sitting, joints protesting in a language he'd learned to understand, meant he was still alive, and that was something. The house was cold. April in Wyoming meant mornings that could still frost and afternoons that might hit 60 if you were lucky. Tom pulled on his jacket and boots and walked downstairs carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on boards that had been unsupported for who knew how long. The kitchen still smelled like mouse droppings and old plaster. He tried the faucet again out of habit and got the same groan of empty pipes. Outside, the wind was already moving across the high prairie, bending the grass in waves that looked like something alive and breathing. Tom walked to his truck and pulled out the 2 5-gallon water jugs he'd filled at a gas station in Buffalo the day before. He'd need to find a more permanent solution. A well pump probably, if the well still worked. Add that to the list of things he had no idea how to fix and no money to pay someone else to handle. He was drinking water straight from the jug and trying to remember if he'd packed anything resembling breakfast when a Ford F-150 pulled into the driveway, newer than his truck by at least a decade, white with ranch plates. Tom set down the water jug and waited. The driver's side door opened, and a young man got out, 24 or 25 years old, wearing jeans and a Stanford hoodie that probably cost more than Tom's entire wardrobe. Cole stood next to his truck looking at the wreckage of the ranch like someone had just shown him a crime scene. His hair was longer than Tom remembered from the funeral, and he'd grown a beard that was still patchy in places because 24 was too young for a proper beard no matter how much you wanted one. He had Sarah's eyes, blue and sharp, and capable of seeing through whatever defense you tried to mount. "You actually did it," Cole said. His voice carried the particular tone of someone confirming their worst suspicions. "You bought this place with your last dollar." Tom nodded. "Good to see you too." Cole walked past him toward the house, stopped at the collapsed porch, turned and surveyed the property. The barn that looked like it was auditioning for a structural failure demonstration. The silo with its lightning scar. The equipment shed where the tractor sat under its blanket of dust. He turned back to Tom with an expression that managed to combine anger and concern and something that might have been fear. "Dad, this is insane. You know that, right? This isn't a fixer-upper. This is condemned property. That barn is going to fall over. The house has a hole in the roof. You're living here like you're deployed to some forward operating base." Tom felt the familiar weight of his son's judgment, the sense that everything he did was being measured against some standard Cole had learned at business school about optimal decision-making and risk assessment. He could have tried to defend himself, could have listed reasons that sounded better than desperation and nostalgia, and the bone-deep need for something that belonged to him. Instead, he walked to the equipment shed and pulled his grandfather's journal from where he'd left it on the workbench. "Read this first," Tom said, handing it to Cole. "Then tell me I'm insane." Cole took the journal carefully, recognizing the age of it. He opened to the first page, and Tom watched his son's expression change as he read the name. James R. Brennan. Cole looked up, confused, then back down at the handwriting. He read the first entry, then the second. He sat down on an overturned bucket near the workbench and kept reading, turning pages slowly, and Tom left him there and walked back to the house. 20 minutes later, Cole found him in the kitchen trying to figure out which cabinet was least likely to contain mouse droppings. Cole's face had changed. The anger was still there, but something else had joined it, something that looked like understanding even if he didn't want to admit it yet. "Grandpa James owned this place," Cole said. The statement came out like an accusation and a question at the same time. From 1953 to 1985, Bank foreclosed while I was deployed. Your grandmother never told me the details. I didn't know which ranch it was. Didn't know it was this one until I found the journal yesterday. And you just happened to buy it at auction. Tom shook his head. I don't know if it was accident or fate or just the universe's sense of humor. But yeah, I bought the same land my grandfather lost to the bank 38 years ago. Cole stood there processing, running calculations Tom could practically see happening behind his eyes. The business school brain trying to make rational sense of something that operated on entirely different logic. Finally, he looked at Tom, and the anger had softened into something closer to resignation. Okay, so what's the plan? Tom almost laughed. The plan is I figure out how to survive here, fix what I can, learn what I don't know, try not to die of stupidity or bad luck. That's not a plan, that's a prayer. Sometimes that's all you get. Cole walked to the window and looked out at the equipment shed. What about the tractor, the one in the journal? Tom followed his gaze. Same one. Hasn't run since 2015. Your grandfather bought it new in 1954. It's been sitting in that shed for 8 years. Can you fix it? I don't know, probably not, but I'm going to try anyway. Cole turned from the window and something in his posture had shifted, the tension easing just enough to suggest he'd made a decision he hadn't wanted to make. I've got 2 weeks before classes start again. I'll help you get started. After that, you're on your own until summer break. Tom felt something loosen in his chest. You don't have to do that. I know, but Grandpa James would have wanted someone to fix that tractor. Might as well be family. They started that afternoon. Cole had called someone he knew from school, a kid named Jesse Martinez who was studying agricultural mechanics at University of Wyoming and happened to be home in Sheridan for spring break. Jesse showed up the next morning driving a Honda Civic that looked embarrassed to be on a gravel road, carrying a toolbox that had belonged to his grandfather, and an optimism that suggested he hadn't yet learned how badly old equipment could betray you. Jesse was 23 years old, compact and dark-haired, with the kind of hands that told you he'd grown up working on things that broke. His grandfather had been a mechanic in Mexico before immigrating, and Jesse had spent summers learning diesel repair and small engine maintenance in shops that smelled like solvent and cigarette smoke. He circled the alley's Chalmers taking photographs on his phone, checking serial numbers against databases, making notes in a composition book he pulled from his back pocket. Okay, Jesse said after 20 minutes of examination. Here's what we're dealing with. Magneto ignition, so no battery to worry about, but the mag itself is probably corroded. Carburetor is definitely varnished. Gas turns to varnish after about 18 months, and this thing's been sitting 8 years. Fuel tank needs to be drained and cleaned. Oil is going to be like tar. All the seals in the hydraulic system are dry rotted. Tires are flat, but the sidewalls aren't cracked, which is lucky. We need to check compression, make sure the engine didn't seize. If it's seized, we're looking at major teardown. Tom listened to the list, feeling each item add weight to the project. How long? If we work weekends and nothing else is wrong, maybe 8 weeks. If we find problems, could be longer. Cole had been quiet, studying the tractor like it was a business case he needed to solve. And if we can't fix it? Jesse shrugged. Then we learned something and it sits here another 8 years, but I don't think we'll fail. This is an Alley's WD. They built these things simple and tough. Long as the block isn't cracked and the crank isn't seized, everything else is just parts and patience. They started with triage. The first step was determining if the engine was seized, which meant trying to turn it over by hand. Jesse showed Tom how to remove the spark plugs and shoot penetrating oil into the cylinders. Then they waited 24 hours for the oil to work its way past the rings. The next day, Jesse attached a breaker bar to the crankshaft pulley, and all three of them leaned on it with their combined weight. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the crank shifted a quarter inch, then another quarter inch, then a full rotation. "Not seized," Jesse said, grinning. "That's our first win." They pulled the oil pan next and found what looked like black paste instead of oil. 8 years of sitting had turned the lubricant into something that had the consistency of roofing tar. Tom scooped it out by hand into a coffee can, the smell of old petroleum and metal filling the equipment shed. His hands turned black up to the wrists, and the grime worked into the creases of his palms in ways that wouldn't wash out for days. Cole documented everything on his phone, taking pictures of each step. He'd started calling it the Ranch Archive, his way of imposing order on chaos. Later, Tom would receive text messages with the photos attached and captions that tried for humor but landed somewhere closer to concern. Day 3, oil change. Dad's hands may never be clean again. They worked every daylight hour and some that weren't. Jesse had a work light that ran off a portable battery, and they'd stay in the equipment shed until 9 or 10 at night, hands numb from cold and tools, taking apart systems that hadn't been touched in nearly a decade. Tom learned by watching and then by doing. Jesse would explain something once, demonstrate, then hand Tom the wrench and make him repeat it until the motion became automatic. The carburetor was the worst. It came apart in pieces that seemed too small and fragile to have ever worked properly. Jets the diameter of a pencil lead. Float valves that controlled fuel flow through tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Gaskets that had hardened to the texture of plastic. They soaked everything in carburetor cleaner for 72 hours. Then Jesse showed Tom how to blow compressed air through each passage, checking that nothing was blocked, that fuel could flow the way the engineering drawings said it should. Tom's hands shook doing the detail work. The PTSD tremor that had started after the Gulf War and never fully left, worse when he was tired or stressed or trying to do something that required fine motor control. He dropped screws, fumbled with tiny springs, had to stop and breathe through moments when his hands simply wouldn't cooperate. Jesse never commented on it, just picked up whatever Tom dropped and handed it back without making it feel like failure. Cole noticed, though. On the 5th day, after Tom had dropped the same needle valve 3 times, Cole took it from him and said, "Take a break. I'll finish this part." Tom wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was too deep. He walked out of the equipment shed and sat on the truck's tailgate, hands in his lap, watching them shake in a way he couldn't control. That's when he heard the vehicle approaching, another truck engine with a knock that suggested deferred maintenance. He looked up to see an old Ford F-250, late 90s vintage, pulling into the driveway. The driver who got out moved slowly, favoring his left side, walking with a cane that had been cut from a tree branch and sanded smooth. He was tall and thin in the way of men who'd been strong once and age had whittled down to essentials. Probably late 70s. White hair cut military short. Face weathered to the texture of saddle leather. Eyes pale blue and sharp, taking in the property and Tom with the kind of assessment that came from decades of evaluating situations and making quick decisions about whether they'd kill you. "You're the fool who bought Peterson's place," the old man said. It wasn't a question. Tom stood up from the tailgate. "That's me." The old man nodded like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I'm Hank Carlson. I own the section east of here. Saw smoke from your chimney and figured I'd come introduce myself." He paused, looking at Tom more carefully. "What unit did you serve?" "1st Armored Division, Gulf War 91, tank mechanic." Something shifted in Hank's expression, not quite approval but close. "Korea, 2nd Infantry Division. I was there for the worst of it." Tom felt the familiar recognition that came from meeting another veteran, the unspoken understanding of what military service did to you. My grandfather served Korea. Same division. James Brennan. Hank went very still. He stared at Tom for a long moment, then a smile crossed his face that looked like it hurt from disuse. James Brennan. I'll be damned. You're his grandson. You knew him. Knew him, son. We drank together every Saturday for 30 years until he died in '85. James told me about his grandson deployed overseas. Army tank mechanic. That was you. Tom nodded, feeling the strangeness of connections reaching across decades. Small world. Hank walked closer, leaning on his cane, studying Tom's face like he was looking for traces of James in the features. James was a good man, best friend I ever had. He lost this place to the bank in '85. Broke his heart. He told me if his grandson ever came back to Wyoming, I should make sure Tom knew that James didn't give up. The bank took it from him. I found his journal, Tom said, hidden in the tractor. He wrote about it, about losing the ranch, about failing. He didn't fail, Hank said, sharp enough to cut. He worked this land for 31 years and built something from nothing. The bank decided the numbers didn't work and took it. That's not failure. That's theft dressed up in paperwork. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind moving between them. Finally, Hank gestured toward the equipment shed. That is Allie's in there. The WD he bought new in '54. Same one, been sitting dead 8 years. We're trying to resurrect it. Hank's expression changed to something Tom couldn't quite read. Mind if I take a look? Tom led him to the equipment shed where Cole and Jesse were still working on the carburetor. They looked up as Hank entered and Tom made introductions. This is Hank Carlson, neighbor. He knew my grandfather. Hank approached the tractor slowly, running his hand along the hood, touching it like you'd touch something that held memories. I rode this machine more times than I can count. James and I helped each other with harvests back when that meant something, before corporate farming turned it all into spreadsheets and GPS. He looked at Jesse. You know what you're doing, son? Jesse nodded. Agricultural mechanics student. My grandfather was a diesel mechanic. I grew up around equipment. Your grandfather have a name? Roberto Torres. He passed 10 years ago. Hank's face changed. Roberto Torres, Sheridan, worked at Morrison's Diesel and Tractor. That's him. Hank smiled again, the expression coming easier this time. Roberto fixed my combine 3 times, charged me half what he should have, and twice invited me to dinner at his house. Good man. Died too young. Jesse looked like he'd been hit. You knew my abuelo. Knew him and respected him. He turned to Tom. This young man's grandfather was one of the best mechanics in the county. If Jesse learned from Roberto, you're in good hands. Over the following weeks, Hank became a regular presence. He'd show up in the mornings with coffee and a thermos and advice born from 60 years of ranching. He didn't work on the tractor directly, his hands too gnarled from arthritis for detail work, but he'd stand nearby and talk them through problems. He knew the alley's WD like he'd built it himself, could describe where every part went and what it did, and which ones failed first when you didn't maintain them properly. Week 5, they tackled the magneto timing. The magneto was the heart of the ignition system, a spinning magnet that created the spark to fire the cylinders. Getting the timing right meant understanding the precise moment when the piston reached top dead center and the spark plug needed to fire. Tom's hands shook badly that day, stress and fatigue combining to make his tremor worse than usual. He dropped tools, couldn't thread bolts. Had to stop and breathe through moments when his hands simply refused to cooperate. Hank watched for a while, then said quietly, Korea taught me to live with fear. Gulf War teach you the same thing. Tom looked at him, surprised by the directness. PTSD. Started after I came home, never completely left. Hank nodded like he understood perfectly. My hands shook for 10 years after I got back. Couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling it. Doctors called it combat fatigue back then. Same thing though. Your brain learned to be scared and forgot how to stop. How'd you deal with it? Worked with my hands. Ranching gave me something to focus on that wasn't the fear. Hands shake less when they're busy. He gestured at the magneto. Keep working. The shaking doesn't mean you can't do it, just means you have to try harder. Tom went back to the timing, and this time when his hands shook he didn't stop. Just adjusted his grip and kept working until the bolts threaded and the timing advanced and Jesse checked it with a degree wheel and confirmed it was perfect. Week 6 brought the fuel system rebuild. The tank had to be pulled and cleaned, every trace of varnished gasoline scraped out. The fuel pump needed new diaphragms. The fuel lines needed to be replaced. Jesse taught Tom basic welding to fix a cracked fitting, and Tom burned through a dozen practice welds before producing one that didn't look like a bird had done it. His hands were covered in burns by the end of the day, small spots where sparks had landed and seared through the skin. But he'd made a weld that would hold pressure, and that felt like winning. Cole left after 2 weeks to go back to Stanford, but he came back every weekend, driving 6 hours each way to help for 2 days. The father-son tension had eased into something closer to partnership. They didn't talk about Sarah or the divorce or the years when Tom had been deployed and Cole had grown up without him. But they worked side by side on a tractor that Tom's grandfather had bought brand new 70 years ago, and that felt like its own kind of conversation. Week 7 was hydraulics. Every seal in the system had dry rotted, which meant ordering parts from a supplier in Iowa and waiting 4 days for shipping. The parts cost $340. Tom's credit card declined. He'd forgotten about the motel charges still processing, the groceries, the gas. He stood in the equipment shed staring at his phone showing the declined transaction and felt the familiar weight of being broke settling over him like weather. Hank was there. He pulled out his wallet without comment and handed Tom $400 in cash, 20s and 50s worn soft from being carried. "I can't take this," Tom said. Hank's expression didn't change. "James loaned me money in 1976 when my first wife got cancer. $8,000 I didn't have and couldn't borrow from any bank. He gave it to me with no paperwork and no interest and told me to pay it back when I could. I never did. He died before I got the chance. So I'm paying him back now through you. Buy the parts." Tom took the money because pride seemed stupid in the face of that kind of generosity. He ordered the parts, and they arrived 4 days later, and Jesse showed him how to install new seals, working carefully to avoid damaging surfaces that had to mate perfectly for the hydraulics to hold pressure. Week 8, final assembly. They'd cleaned every part, replaced everything that had failed or worn beyond specification, painted the sheet metal with Allie's orange that Jesse found at a tractor supply store 2 hours away. By June 14th, the tractor looked almost new, sitting in the equipment shed with fresh paint and new tires inflated to proper pressure, and all its systems reassembled. June 15th, they attempted to start it. Tom, Cole, Jesse, and Hank gathered around the machine like it was an altar. They'd done everything right, followed every procedure, checked and double-checked every connection. But 8 years was a long time for a machine to sit dead, and there were no guarantees that turning a key would result in anything except disappointment. Tom sat in the seat where his grandfather had sat for decades. The leather had been cleaned and treated, still cracked but serviceable. He turned on the fuel valve, advanced the throttle 1/4, made sure the transmission was in neutral. Then he reached for the key. The starter cranked strong and steady. The engine turned over once, twice, coughed and died. Tom waited 10 seconds and tried again. Crank, cough, sputter, almost. He tried a third time. The engine caught, coughed, caught again. This time it held. Black smoke poured from the exhaust, 8 years of accumulated carbon and dust burning off. The engine knocked and rattled and made sounds that probably meant something expensive was loose inside. But it ran. The Alley's Chalmers WD that hadn't fired in 8 years rumbled to life in the equipment shed, and Tom sat there with his hands on the wheel and tears running down his face. He looked at Cole standing next to Jesse, both of them grinning like kids. He looked at Hank, who had his hand over his mouth and his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. The old man nodded once, sharp and definite, a gesture that said James would be proud. Tom let the tractor run for 10 minutes, listening to the engine settle into its rhythm, rough but functional, alive. Then he shut it down and climbed off the seat and stood there not knowing what to say. Cole broke the silence. Grandpa's tractor runs. After 8 years, it actually runs. Jesse was already making notes in his composition book. Needs a tune-up. The timing's a little rough, but yeah, it runs. Hank walked over and put his hand on Tom's shoulder. Your grandfather told me once that machines last longer than people when you treat them right. He was right. This tractor's 70 years old, and it just proved it's got more life in it than most of us. They walked back to the house, and Hank pulled a bottle of whiskey from his truck and poured 4 glasses, passing them around. To James Brennan, Hank said, raising his glass, who built something that lasted. They drank, and the whiskey burned in a way that felt appropriate. Tom stood on the porch of the house his grandfather had built and lost, looking at the tractor that had just started after 8 years of being dead. And for the first time since Sarah died, he felt something other than grief. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like purpose. The sense that broken things could be fixed if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and had people willing to help you do the work. That feeling lasted exactly 5 days. On June 20th, a white sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man in his 40s got out wearing slacks and a polo shirt with the Wyoming Department of Water Resources logo. He carried a clipboard and an iPad, and the expression of someone delivering news he knew you wouldn't want to hear. Mr. Brennan, I'm Craig Morrison, Water Resource Inspector. I need to talk to you about violations associated with this property. Tom invited him inside. They sat at the kitchen table, and Morrison pulled up files on his iPad, turning it so Tom could see. Aerial photographs from 2012 through 2015 showed irrigation ditches running from the creek that marked the southern boundary of the property to fields that had been under cultivation. Morrison traced the route with his finger. Previous owner, Howard Peterson, illegally diverted water from Crazy Woman Creek without proper permits. The violation was documented in 2015 but never resolved. Peterson went into foreclosure before we could collect the fine. Now the property's transferred to you and the violation comes with it. Tom felt his stomach drop. How much? $12,000. Due by August 1st or the property goes to mandatory state auction for unpaid environmental violations. I just bought this place. I didn't divert anything. Morrison's expression was sympathetic but firm. Violation transfers with title should have been disclosed in the foreclosure documents. He paused. It wasn't disclosed, was it? Tom pulled out the auction paperwork and they went through it together. No mention of water violations anywhere in the disclosures. Morrison made notes on his iPad, frowning. That's irregular. Who handled the foreclosure sale? Farmers Bank of Buffalo. Loan officer was Walter Gaines. Morrison wrote that down. You might have legal recourse if the violation was deliberately omitted, but that doesn't change the immediate situation. Fines still due August 1st. After Morrison left, Tom sat at the kitchen table doing math that didn't work. He had $0. The credit cards were maxed. He couldn't borrow $12,000 from any bank without income or collateral beyond property that apparently came with hidden liabilities. He called Cole and explained the situation. Cole said he'd do research on the bank and the disclosure requirements and call back. 3 hours later, Cole called from Palo Alto, his voice tight with anger. "Dad, I think you got scammed. Walter Gaines is listed as a broker for Summit Development Corporation. They're a Denver company that buys distressed ranch properties, rezones them for residential development, and flips them for massive profit." "What does that have to do with my property?" "Everything. Summit's been buying up ranches in Johnson County for 2 years. If you can't pay the fine, the property goes to state auction. Guess who shows up and buys it for cheap because they know about the violation ahead of time and factor it into their bid? Summit Development. Gaines deliberately omitted the water violation from your auction disclosure. He was counting on you to fail." Tom sat with that information, feeling something darker than anger building in his chest. "So what do I do?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Can you borrow the money?" "From who? I don't have $12,000. I don't know anyone who does." But Tom did know someone. He just didn't want to ask. Hank showed up the next morning before Tom had figured out how to start the conversation. The old man walked into the kitchen without knocking, poured himself coffee from the pot Tom had made, and sat down at the table. "Heard about the water fine. Morrison called me yesterday, asked if I knew anything about Peterson's illegal irrigation. I told him I knew, but figured the state would have collected before the foreclosure." Tom looked at him. "You knew about the violation?" Everyone knew. Peterson was desperate. Drought year in 2014. He diverted creek water without permits and hoped nobody would notice. State caught him, documented it, but he went broke before they could collect. Hank paused. "I should have warned you before the auction. I'm sorry." "It's not your fault. You didn't know I was bidding." Hank set down his coffee cup. "How much do you need?" "I can't ask you for money, Hank. You've already given me too much." "You're not asking. I'm offering. How much?" $12,000, due August 1st. Hank nodded like he'd expected that number. "I'll write you a check today. Pay me back when you can. No interest." Tom felt his throat close. "I can't pay you back. I don't have income. I don't know when I'll have income." Hank's expression hardened. "James loaned me $8,000 in '76 when I had nothing. Told me neighbors help neighbors and not to worry about the timeline. I never paid him back. He died before I could. I've been waiting 47 years to return that favor. So you're going to take this money and pay that fine and keep this land because that's what James would have wanted and it's what I want. Understood?" Tom understood. He took the check Hank wrote and deposited it at the bank that afternoon. On July 28th, he paid the water violation fine in full. The property stayed in his name. Summit Development's plan, whatever it had been, failed. That night, Tom sat on the porch and wrote in a notebook he'd started keeping. The journal had become his way of making sense of things, a habit he'd picked up from his grandfather. He wrote about the tractor starting, about Hank's generosity, about the water fine and the scam that had almost worked, about Cole coming back every weekend to help fix something that mattered, about learning that fixing broken things was possible if you had the right people and enough time, and the stubborn refusal to quit when smart people would walk away. The alley sat in the equipment shed, orange paint bright even in darkness, ready for work after 8 years of sitting dead. Tom had learned he could fix things he didn't understand if he was willing to try. He'd learned that debts could be repaid across generations. He'd learned that community meant more than he'd realized when he was alone in that motel room spending his last dollars on temporary shelter. He closed the notebook and looked out at 160 acres that belonged to him and him alone. The house still had a hole in the roof. The barn still leaned at an angle that suggested imminent collapse, but the tractor ran, and that felt like proof that resurrection was possible for machines and maybe for men who'd been left for dead by circumstances they couldn't control. Tomorrow he'd start learning how to actually use the equipment to work the land. Tonight, he'd earned the right to sit still and let the wind move through the dark and know that he'd survived another day in a place his grandfather had loved and lost and somehow guided him back to. Hank started teaching Tom to farm on the first Monday of July, showing up at dawn with coffee and the kind of patience you only learned from 60 years of making the same mistakes and surviving them. They stood in the field behind the house, 40 acres of grass and sage brush that hadn't been worked in a decade, and Hank explained what needed to happen before anything could grow there. First you disc, Hank said, gesturing at the overgrown field. Break up the soil, turn under the weeds, get everything loosened up so water can penetrate and roots can establish. Then you drag it smooth. Then you seed. Then you pray the weather cooperates because that's the only part you can't control. Tom listened and took notes in a composition book he'd started carrying, writing down everything Hank said like it was scripture. The alley's WD sat ready in the equipment shed, orange paint bright in morning sun, waiting for work it hadn't done in 8 years. Hank had loaned Tom his disc harrow, a piece of equipment that looked like a medieval torture device with dozens of curved blades designed to cut through soil and vegetation. Hitching it to the tractor took an hour of adjusting the 3-point hitch and checking hydraulic connections. And by the time they finished, Tom was sweating through his shirt despite the early hour. Hank climbed up to stand beside the tractor seat, one hand on Tom's shoulder for balance. You want to overlap your passes by about 2 feet. Miss a spot and you'll see it all season. Keep the depth consistent. Too shallow and you're wasting time. Too deep and you'll bring up hardpan that won't grow anything but regret. Tom started the alleys and felt the engine settle into its familiar rumble, rough but reliable, 70 years old and still working. He eased out the clutch and the disc bit into ground that hadn't been turned since before the foreclosure. The tractor pulled hard against resistance, engine note dropping, and Tom had to throttle up to keep from stalling. Behind him, the disc blades carved through sage brush and buffalo grass, turning up soil that smelled like earth and rain, and decades of accumulated organic matter breaking down. The work was meditative once he found the rhythm. Pick a landmark in the distance. Keep the tractor tracking straight. Turn at the end of each pass. Overlap by 2 feet. But the meditation came with a price Tom hadn't anticipated. 4 hours into the first day, his hands started shaking worse than they had in months. The vibration from the tractor combined with the constant grip on the steering wheel triggered his PTSD tremor until he couldn't hold the wheel steady. The tractor wandered in its path, creating wavy lines instead of straight ones. Tom stopped at the end of a pass and sat there with his hands in his lap, watching them shake in a way he couldn't control. The shame of it felt fresh even though he'd lived with this for 30 years. Combat fatigue, they'd called it after the Gulf War. PTSD, the doctors named it later. Whatever you labeled it, the result was the same. Moments when his body simply refused to cooperate, when the tremor took over and made him look weak or broken or incapable of simple tasks that normal people handled without thought. Hank walked out to the tractor carrying water, and Tom's pride wouldn't let him hide what was happening. The old man climbed up on the running board and looked at Tom's shaking hands without comment for a long moment. "Korea did that to me too," Hank said finally. "Hands shook for 10 years after I came home. Couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling. Couldn't sign my name without it looking like a drunk did it. Doctor gave me pills that made it worse." "How'd you make it stop?" "Didn't stop, just learned to work through it. Ranching helped. Gave me something to focus on. That wasn't the fear. Hands shake less when they're busy doing something that matters. Tom looked at the field he'd been disking, the wavy lines visible in the turned soil. I'm making a mess of this. You're learning. That's different than failing. Hank paused, studying Tom's face. You know what I learned in Korea that saved my life more than any combat training? How to live with being scared. How to keep working even when every part of you is shaking. That's not weakness. That's the opposite. They worked through the rest of that day, and Tom's hands never fully stopped shaking, but he learned to adjust his grip, to work with the tremor instead of fighting it, to accept that straight lines were going to be approximate instead of perfect. By evening, he disked 12 acres and learned that farming was less about precision and more about persistence. His entire body hurt in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He climbed down from the tractor, and his legs nearly gave out, muscles locked from sitting in one position for 10 hours. The rest of July passed in similar fashion, but each day Tom's hands shook a little less, or maybe he just got better at not caring when they did. He disked during the day, broke for lunch that Hank brought from town, disked until dark. By July 20th, he'd finished all 40 acres, and the field looked ready, soil turned and loosened, waiting for seed. That's when the drought hit in earnest. Wyoming weather forecasts tracked a high-pressure system that had parked over the region and showed no signs of moving. Tom planted Timothy and clover mix that Hank said was forgiving for beginners, broadcasting seed across 40 acres while the sun beat down from a sky that hadn't seen clouds in 2 weeks. The seed went in dry. The irrigation system Tom had pieced together from salvaged parts pulled water from Crazy Woman Creek. But by the 3rd week of July, the creek had dropped to a trickle that barely filled the irrigation ditches. Tom stood at the creek bank watching water that should have been flowing strong reduced to pools connected by threads of current. The hay seed he'd planted was germinating, but growth was slow, stalks appearing thin and stressed. Hank walked the field with him in heat that made the horizon shimmer and delivered the news Tom already knew. Driest July in 40 years according to the Weather Service. Your hay's going to struggle. Might get 18 inches if you're lucky. Need 24 for a decent first cutting. What do I do? Keep irrigating what you can. Pray for rain. Accept that first-year yields are going to be low and plan accordingly. Tom spent the next month managing water like it was currency, more valuable than the money he didn't have. He'd wake at 4 in the morning and move irrigation lines, making sure each section of field got some water even if it wasn't enough. The physical work helped with the PTSD in ways Tom hadn't expected. The routine of it, the simple mechanical tasks of connecting pipes and opening valves and watching water flow, gave his hands something to do that quieted the shaking. By early August, he could work a full day without the tremor becoming debilitating, and he started to understand what Hank had meant about ranching being therapeutic. But the drought was relentless. August brought temperatures that hit 95 degrees 3 days in a row, heat that was brutal for Wyoming at this elevation. Tom's hay grew but slowly, stalks thin and sparse. By mid-August, when it should have been ready for first cutting, the field looked anemic. Hank walked it again and shook his head. You'll get hay, just not much. Maybe 150 bales from 40 acres instead of 350. It's still production, still proof you can grow something. Tom did the math. 150 bales at $6 each was $900. He'd spent $1,200 on seed alone. Even without factoring in equipment costs and his own labor, he was losing money. The financial pressure built like water behind a dam, and he started looking at job listings in Buffalo and Sheridan, trying to figure out how to generate income while still maintaining the ranch. Then on August 18th at 2 in the afternoon, everything changed. Tom was in town buying supplies when he saw smoke rising from the south, a column of gray that climbed into blue sky like something alive and reaching. He drove back to the ranch listening to emergency radio traffic, dispatch coordinating fire crews, reports of a lightning strike 3 miles south in dry timber. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the smoke had grown from a column to a wall that blocked out half the sky. A sheriff's deputy was already there, a young woman in her 30s named Martinez who looked at Tom like he was an idiot for coming back. She had her vehicle positioned to block the driveway, emergency lights strobing. "You need to evacuate now," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered this message before and watched people ignore it. "Lightning strike in the Medicine Bow National Forest. Fire's already consumed 200 acres and it's moving fast. Winds gusting 40 miles per hour and pushing flames north. You've got maybe 90 minutes before it's here." Tom looked at the wall of smoke, could see orange glow beneath it now as the sun started to set, and the fire became visible against darkening sky. "I'm not leaving." "Sir, this is mandatory evacuation. You stay and you're going to die. We can't help you if you refuse to leave." "Then I die here." Martinez tried arguing, but Tom had already stopped listening. He was calculating what needed to be done. The creek was too low to be useful for fighting fire, but he had the irrigation system. The disc harrow could cut a fire break if he worked fast enough. The alleys could run all night if he pushed it. The deputy's radio crackled with traffic about other evacuations, other people refusing to leave their land, and finally she gave up. "I'm marking you as refused evacuation," she said, making notes on a clipboard. "When they find your body tomorrow, remember that you chose this." She drove away and Tom watched her tail lights disappear down the gravel road. Then he turned and looked at his ranch, at 40 acres of struggling hay and a house with a patched roof and a barn that had been braced against collapse. Everything he owned was here. Everything his grandfather had built and lost was here. He wasn't running from it. The fire was visible over the southern ridge now, a line of orange that stretched horizon to horizon. Wind carried smoke thick enough to taste, ash falling like dirty snow. Tom fired up the alleys and attached the disc harrow, checked the fuel tank, made sure the hydraulics were working. Then he started cutting a fire break around his house and barn and equipment shed, disking a strip 50 feet wide in a circle that would take everything he had. The work was brutal. The tractor's headlights cut through smoke that was getting thicker by the hour, turning the world into a tunnel of visibility that extended maybe 20 feet ahead. Tom's eyes watered from the smoke. His lungs burned. The heat built even though the flames were still miles away, radiant energy carried on wind that had to be gusting 50 now. The tractor protested but held, engine screaming under load but refusing to quit. By midnight, he'd completed half the fire break and moved on to soaking everything inside the perimeter. He'd rigged the irrigation system to run full blast, sprinklers throwing water on the house roof, the barn walls, the ground inside the fire break. Water was life right now, and Tom used every drop the dying creek could provide. He climbed onto the barn roof with a garden hose and wetted down shingles that had dried to kindling over decades of Wyoming sun, working by flashlight, coughing from smoke that was thick enough now that breathing felt like inhaling ground glass. At 3 in the morning, the fire crested the ridge to the south. Tom stood in his yard and watched a wall of flame 200 feet high move toward him like something from biblical descriptions of hell. The sound was worse than the sight, a roar that combined wind and burning wood and the simple physics of combustion consuming oxygen faster than the atmosphere could replace it. Embers fell in sheets, landing on wet ground inside his fire break and hissing out, landing on dry grass beyond the perimeter and igniting new fires that spread in smaller circles. Tom had seen combat, had been in Iraq when Scud missiles came in and all you could do was hit the deck and pray the targeting was off, had felt that particular terror of waiting for something that could kill you and having no control over whether it did. This was worse. The fire was visible and immediate, and so large that human effort seemed meaningless against it. But he'd cut the fire break and soaked the buildings and done everything he could, so he climbed back on the alleys and drove to meet it. The main fire hit his fire break at 3:20 and slowed. The disk ground had nothing to burn, the turned soil creating a gap in fuel that the fire couldn't jump easily. For 10 minutes Tom thought he might actually survive. The flames bent and twisted along the firebreak's edge, following it east and west but not crossing. Then the wind shifted. Not much, maybe 15 degrees to the east, but enough to push flames around the firebreak's western edge toward the barn. Tom drove straight at the fire with the disc engaged, cutting a new break to redirect the flame's path. Heat blistered the paint on the tractor's hood, bubbling it up in places and peeling it back. Smoke was thick enough that Tom couldn't see 5 feet ahead, navigating by memory and the glow of flames to his left. The engine screamed but held, 70 years old and pulling harder than it had probably pulled in decades. Tom's shirt was soaked with sweat, and smoke had turned his spit black. The world narrowed to the next 10 feet of ground, the next pass with the disc, the next adjustment to keep the tractor tracking straight when visibility was zero and heat made thinking difficult. Tom's hands shook violently, but it didn't matter anymore because the steering wheel was shaking too from the vibration and the load. He worked through panic that wanted to make him stop and run, worked through pain in his lungs from smoke inhalation, worked through the absolute certainty that he was going to die out here alone fighting a fire that was too big for any individual to stop. At 4:30 the wind shifted again, hard to the east, pushing flames away from Tom's property and toward empty rangeland where fire crews had established containment lines 2 miles out. The immediate danger passed, but Tom kept working, kept cutting fire break and soaking ground and watching for ember fires that could reignite if he stopped paying attention. By dawn the main fire had moved east and north, away from his ranch, and toward firefighting resources that could actually handle it. Tom sat on the alleys in the middle of his fire break covered in ash and soot and smoke, watching the sun rise through haze that turned everything the color of old blood. The house stood. The barn stood. The equipment shed stood. Everything inside the fire break had survived. To the south, 3 neighboring ranches had burned to bare ground, houses and barns and decades of accumulated life reduced to ash and twisted metal, and the kind of loss you couldn't quantify in dollars. He climbed down from the tractor on legs that barely held him and threw up from smoke inhalation and exhaustion, and the delayed understanding of how close he'd come to dying. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold the water bottle someone had left on his porch. He sat on the steps and waited for the shaking to stop, and it didn't. So he sat there shaking and watching smoke rise from the southern horizon and trying to process that he'd survived. Hank found him 2 hours later. The old man's truck pulled up slowly, and Hank climbed out using his cane for support, walking the fire break Tom had cut and examining the work with the critical eye of someone who'd seen a lot of fire breaks cut in 60 years of ranching. He looked at the alley still sitting where Tom had parked it, covered in ash but intact. He looked at Tom sitting on the porch steps trying to get his hands to stop shaking. "Deputy Martinez called me at 5 this morning," Hank said. "Told me you refused evacuation and she expected to find your body today. I told her she didn't know you very well." Tom couldn't answer. His throat was too raw from smoke. He just sat there while his body tried to process what he'd just survived. "You're either the bravest man I know or the dumbest," Hank continued. "Maybe both. But you saved this place when everyone with sense ran. That means something to people out here." Over the next week, word spread through the ranching community in the way news traveled in rural areas, faster than you'd think possible when neighbors lived miles apart. The new guy, the veteran who'd bought the Peterson place that everyone thought was condemned, had stayed during mandatory evacuation and fought a wildfire alone all night with a 70-year-old tractor and enough stubbornness to make it work. 3 families whose ranches had burned came to Tom asking if they could camp on his property while they figured out what came next. The Johnsons showed up first, a couple in their 60s with 2 grandkids they'd been raising since their daughter died. Everything they owned had burned. Tom helped them set up in the barn, moving hay bales to create living space, rigging tarps for privacy. The Hendersons came next, younger couple with a baby and nowhere to go. Tom gave them the downstairs bedroom and took his sleeping bag back upstairs. The Yazzie family, Navajo ranchers who'd worked their land for 3 generations, arrived last with a camper trailer that had survived because it was parked at a relative's place during the fire. Tom shared food and water and the labor of rebuilding. The Johnsons' grandson was 17 and strong, helped Tom finish the harvest when the hay was finally ready in late September. Henderson knew carpentry and helped repair the barn's roof properly instead of the patch job Tom had done. Ray Yazzie was a welder and fixed equipment that had been held together with baling wire and prayer. They lived on Tom's property for 6 weeks while insurance companies processed claims and FEMA assistance trickled through bureaucracy. In that time, something shifted in how the community saw Tom. Before the fire, he'd been the outsider, the city guy who'd bought a condemned ranch and would probably quit before winter. After the fire, he was something else. Someone who'd stayed when staying was stupid. Someone who'd taken in families who lost everything without asking for rent or gratitude or anything, except help with the work. The ranchers who'd been skeptical started stopping by with supplies. Merle Hutchins brought a 100-pound propane tank for heating. Sarah Chen dropped off clothes her grandkids had outgrown for the Johnson kids. People helped without being asked because that's how it worked out here, and Tom was learning that community wasn't something you joined. It was something you earned through action when it would have been easier to walk away. In September, the community came together for what they called a barn raising, though it was really barn repair and house improvement. 15 men and women showed up on a Saturday morning with trucks full of lumber and tools, and the kind of experience that came from fixing things that broke constantly. They spent the day bracing the barn's foundation properly, replacing rotted support posts with pressure-treated lumber, patching the roof with new shingles, reinforcing the frame so it wouldn't lean anymore. Nobody asked if Tom needed help. They just showed up and worked, and when Tom tried to thank them, Merle Hutchins waved him off with hands gnarled from arthritis and 70 years of manual labor. "We help veterans here. You served your country in the Gulf War. Now we serve you, that's how it works." Tom wanted to argue that his service had been 30 years ago, and the connection felt tenuous. But these people had lived through Vietnam and Korea, and understood that service meant something beyond the uniform. So he worked alongside them and accepted the help, and learned that pride was fine, but community was necessary. By late September, the first harvest came in, and the drought's damage was clear. Instead of 350 bales from 40 acres, Tom got 180. Hank had predicted 150, so exceeding that felt like a small victory, even though the math was brutal. 180 bales at $5.50 each was $990. Hank bought 50 bales himself and paid full price, even though they both knew he was buying them as charity. Tom deposited the check and looked at his bank account with the kind of honesty that didn't allow for optimism. $600 in the bank, $20,000 in debt to Hank and various suppliers, and the credit cards he'd maxed buying seed and equipment parts. The income from one harvest wasn't going to cover even a month's expenses. He needed work, needed cash flow, needed something to bridge the gap between planting and next year's harvest that might be better or might be worse depending on whether he couldn't control. The job came through the ranching network. Johnson County Roads Department needed snowplow drivers starting in November. $16 an hour, 60 hours a week minimum through March when snow was consistent. It meant leaving the ranch at 4 in the morning and getting back after dark, working 12-hour shifts clearing highways and maintaining equipment. The work was mindless and cold, and exactly what Tom needed to keep from thinking too hard about the gap between what he owed and what he could pay. He took the job, started in early November when the first real snow fell and dumped 8 inches overnight. The plow routes were long and repetitive, giving Tom hours alone in the cab of a county truck to think about everything and nothing. His hands still shook sometimes, but the work was forgiving of that. Steering a plow truck didn't require precision the way disking a field did. He came home exhausted enough to sleep without the nightmares that had plagued him since the Gulf War, fell into bed and woke 4 hours later to do it again. Hank had bought 6 Angus calves at the September cattle sale and offered to co-sign a loan so Tom could start a breeding operation. $4,200 borrowed from the bank that knew Tom had collateral now, land that was worth something even if the buildings weren't. The calves arrived in October, 6 black Angus that bawled and kicked and acted terrified of everything. Tom and Jesse spent a weekend fencing the back 40 acres, fixing old fence line that had sagged and rusted, learning how to stretch wire tight enough to keep cattle in, but not so tight it would snap when temperature swings made metal expand and contract. Jesse came up from university every weekend that fall, helping with projects that needed 2 people. They built a simple shelter for the calves from salvaged lumber and tin roofing. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep them out of weather that could kill young cattle if they got too cold and wet. Jesse's hands were steadier than Tom's, better at the detail work of cutting angles and driving nails straight. They worked well together, Jesse explaining what needed to happen and Tom providing muscle and persistence. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in late October, 4 inches overnight that turned the landscape white and quiet. Tom drove snowplow routes through dark hours, came home to feed cattle and check fence and maintain equipment, slept 4 hours and did it again. The ranch disappeared under snow that drifted 6 feet deep in places. The alleys sat in the equipment shed under a tarp, hibernating until spring. Tom learned that winter in Wyoming wasn't something you survived by being tough. You survived by being stubborn and prepared and willing to do the work even when every part of you wanted to quit. The families who'd camped on Tom's property after the fire moved into temporary housing by November. The Johnsons found a rental in Buffalo. The Hendersons got a FEMA trailer. The Yazes relocated to family land while they rebuilt. They left with thanks and promises to help when spring planting came, and Tom was alone again in the way he'd been alone in the motel room before the auction. But it felt different now. He had land. He had work. He had Hank stopping by when weather allowed to check on him and the cattle. The solitude was there, but it had shape and purpose instead of just being emptiness. On December 23rd, Tom drove to Hank's ranch to deliver Christmas supplies, food and firewood and a bottle of whiskey because the old man lived alone 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. Hank's driveway was drifted with snow but passable. Tom knocked on the door and got no answer. Knocked again. Nothing. He tried the door and found it unlocked, which should have been his first warning that something was wrong because Hank locked his doors even though crime in Johnson County was measured in single digits. Hank was on the kitchen floor, unconscious, skin gray, breathing shallow. Tom's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and called 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, asking questions Tom answered while he checked Hank's pulse and made sure his airway was clear. The ambulance would take 20 minutes to arrive, rural response times being what they were. Tom did CPR the way the Army had taught him 30 years ago, chest compressions and rescue breathing, 30 and 2, keeping count and trying not to think about whether Hank was going to die here on his kitchen floor. The paramedics arrived and took over, and Tom stepped back, letting professionals work. They loaded Hank onto a stretcher, and the lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s who looked like she'd seen everything, gave Tom a nod of respect. "You kept him alive. Good work." Tom followed the ambulance to the hospital in Buffalo, driving too fast on roads that were ice in places, not caring about the danger because Hank couldn't die. Not now. Not when Tom was just starting to understand what the old man had been trying to teach him. The hospital emergency room smelled like disinfectant and anxiety, and Tom waited in a room with plastic chairs bolted to the floor and a television showing news nobody watched. The doctor was young, probably early 30s, with the careful expression of someone about to deliver information she knew would hurt. "Mr. Carlson had a stroke. Significant blockage in the carotid artery. He's been ignoring symptoms for months. High blood pressure, dizziness, memory issues. All warning signs he should have addressed." "Is he going to be okay?" "He needs surgery and extensive recovery. We've stabilized him, but the next 72 hours are critical." Tom asked when he could see Hank, and the doctor said soon. 3 days later, on December 26th, Hank woke up in a hospital bed with tubes running to machines that beeped in rhythms Tom had learned to hate during Sarah's last weeks. The old man looked smaller than he should have, diminished by illness in a way that combat and ranching and 78 years of living hadn't managed. Tom sat in the chair beside the bed, and Hank turned his head slowly to look at him. His speech was slurred but understandable. "Tom, you found me." "I found you. You're going to be okay." Hank's expression suggested he disagreed but didn't have energy to argue. "My will. Lawyer has it. Miller and Associates in Buffalo. If I die, ranch goes to you." Tom felt like he'd been punched. "Hank, you're not dying. You're having surgery. You'll recover and run your ranch for another 20 years. Listen," Hank's voice was weak but determined. "No kids. No family. 640 acres next to yours. I want it to stay ranch, not sold to developers. Promise me." "I promise, but you're going to be fine." Hank closed his eyes, and Tom thought he'd fallen asleep. Then the old man spoke again, quieter. "Your grandfather, James. He didn't sell the ranch because he wanted to. Bank foreclosed in '86. He owed $18,000, couldn't pay, broke his heart, killed him faster than the heart disease." Tom had read this in the journal, but hearing it from Hank made it real in a different way. "I know. I found his journal. He wrote about it. He told me something else. Made me promise." Hank paused, breathing hard from the effort of talking. "If his grandson Tom ever came back to Wyoming, I should tell him that James didn't fail, that the bank took it from him. That failure is different than being beaten, that you can ask for help. That pride is fine, but survival is better." Tom felt his throat close. The hospital room with its beeping machines and antiseptic smell seemed to fade, and all he could see was Hank's weathered face, carrying a message across 40 years. "He wanted you to know you don't have to make the same mistakes he did," Hank said. "Don't fail him, Tom. Don't fail yourself. Don't let pride kill you the way it killed him." "I won't, I promise." Hank nodded and let his eyes close, exhausted from the conversation. Tom sat there for another hour watching the old man sleep, thinking about debts that spanned generations and promises made to men who were gone, and the weight of trying to build something that would last longer than the people who built it. When the nurse finally asked him to leave so Hank could rest, Tom walked out into December cold and sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot and cried for the second time since Sarah died. He drove back to the ranch through snow that had started falling again, big flakes that caught in his headlights and made the road ahead disappear into white. The house was dark when he arrived. No power because he'd turned off the main breaker to save on electrical costs. Just the wood stove throwing heat into rooms that never got warm enough. Tom lit candles and sat at the kitchen table with his grandfather's journal and read the entries from 1985 again. Bank took the ranch today. Gave me 60 days to clear out. Couldn't bring myself to tell Claire how bad it got. Couldn't bring myself to tell Tom. He's still overseas and I'll probably be dead before he gets back. Tom had been 27 in 1985, stationed in Germany after his first deployment to Iraq, learning tank maintenance and trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be. His grandfather had been dying and losing everything, and Tom hadn't known, hadn't been there, hadn't had the chance to help or even say goodbye. The guilt felt fresh even though it was nearly 40 years old. He closed the journal and looked around the kitchen. The roof was patched. The barn was braced. The cattle were sheltered. He'd survived a wildfire. He had a job that would carry him through winter. He owed $20,000, but Hank had said to ask for help, to not let pride kill him the way it had killed James. Tom pulled out his composition book and wrote the date, December 26, 2023. Then he wrote what felt true even if the evidence didn't support it yet. I'm not failing. The bank won't take this place like they took it from Grandpa. I'll ask for help when I need it. I'll accept what people offer. I'll survive this winter and plant in spring and keep the promises I made to men who aren't here to see whether I keep them. Hank told me pride is fine, but survival is better. I'm choosing survival. He closed the book and fed the wood stove and climbed the stairs to his bedroom. Through the window he could see snow falling in darkness, covering everything in white that would melt in spring and reveal whatever remained underneath. Tom got into bed and pulled the blankets tight and slept the sleep of someone who'd worked hard enough to earn rest, dreaming of tractors that ran and land that produced and men who trusted him with legacies he was still learning how to carry. Hank came home from the hospital in late February, but not to his own ranch. The doctor said he needed someone nearby during recovery, someone who could monitor medication schedules and watch for signs of another stroke and help if he fell or forgot where he was during moments when the brain damage manifested as confusion. Tom drove to Buffalo and picked up the old man from a rehabilitation facility that smelled like institutional cleaning products and resignation, bringing him back to the ranch that had been James Brennan's and was now Tom's and would someday belong to whoever came after. They set up Hank in the downstairs bedroom, the one Tom had claimed when he first moved in 8 months earlier. Tom moved his sleeping bag upstairs to a room where the hole in the roof had been patched with plywood and tar paper, but cold still came through gaps in ways that made mornings feel like punishment. Hank protested the arrangement, but didn't have the strength to argue for long, his body still recovering from surgery that had cleared the blockage in his carotid artery, but left him diminished in ways that went beyond the physical. The stroke had taken something from Hank that couldn't be measured in medical terms. His left hand didn't grip like it used to. His balance was off in ways that made walking without assistance dangerous. Words sometimes got stuck between his brain and his mouth, creating pauses mid-sentence while he searched for language that had always come automatically before. But worse than the physical symptoms was the look in his eyes sometimes, a flicker of fear when he realized how close he'd come to dying alone on his kitchen floor. The winter months became a routine of care that felt like payback for everything Hank had taught Tom about surviving on land that didn't forgive mistakes. Tom worked his snowplow shifts from 4 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, 12-hour days clearing highways and maintaining county equipment. He'd come home exhausted and cook meals that Hank picked at without enthusiasm, food tasting different or wrong after the stroke changed something in his perception. They'd do physical therapy exercises the hospital had prescribed. Hank gripping a rubber ball and squeezing until his hand cramped, walking laps around the kitchen table with Tom spotting him in case balance failed. Then Tom would fall into bed exhausted enough that sleep came without the usual nightmares, wake 4 hours later and do it all again. On weekends, Jesse drove up from university and helped with the cattle, checking fence lines that had been pushed by snow drifts, breaking ice on water troughs with an axe when temperatures stayed below zero for days. The work never stopped, but Tom found himself grateful for it. The routine keeping his hands busy and his mind occupied, and the PTSD tremor mostly under control. Hank improved slowly through February and into March. By early March, he could walk short distances without the cane. By mid-March, his speech had cleared enough that the slur was barely noticeable unless he was tired or stressed. But something fundamental had changed in how Hank talked about his future. He used past tense when discussing his ranch, spoke about ranching like it was something he used to do instead of something he'd return to. He talked about mortality with the casual acceptance of men who'd made peace with being closer to the end than the beginning. One evening in late March, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over fields that were still brown and dormant, waiting for spring warmth to arrive and prove that survival through winter had been worth the effort. Hank had a blanket wrapped around his shoulders against cold that wasn't really there anymore, his body's thermostat broken by medication and age, and the simple wearing down of systems that had run for 79 years without maintenance. "I'm not going back to my place," Hank said quietly, his voice almost lost under the wind. "I thought I would. Thought I'd get strong enough to manage on my own, but I'm done pretending I can do it alone." Tom didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched between them while darkness gathered in the low places between hills and stars, began showing in the east where light pollution from Buffalo didn't reach. "I've been thinking about my will," Hank continued. 640 acres next to yours, house and barn and equipment. No family to leave it to, no kids, no grandkids, just land that needs someone who'll take care of it the way it deserves. "You've got years left," Tom said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Hank smiled without humor, the expression weathered and tired. "Maybe, maybe not. Stroke showed me something I'd been ignoring. I'm 79 years old. Could drop dead tomorrow or live another 10 years, but either way I need to know the land goes to someone who understands what it means. Someone who won't sell it to developers the minute I'm cold." Tom felt the weight of what Hank wasn't quite saying directly. "You want me to have it. I want you to earn it, keep ranching your place, keep building something that lasts. When I'm gone, it's yours, but there's a condition. You keep it working ranch for at least 10 years. Sell before that and it goes to the Wyoming Agricultural Land Trust. I need to know it stays ranch, not houses and strip malls." Tom looked out at darkness and thought about 800 acres total, about the responsibility of that much land, about promises made to men who wouldn't live to see whether you kept them. "Why me?" "Because James trusted me with his truth and his friendship for 30 years. Because you stayed when that wildfire came and everyone with sense evacuated. Because you take care of an old man who can't take care of himself anymore without making him feel like a burden." Hank paused, breathing carefully. "Because you're the kind of stubborn that built this country before we got soft and started thinking comfort mattered more than legacy." They sat in silence until the cold drove them inside, and Tom helped Hank to bed and climbed the stairs to his own room, where he lay awake thinking about the geometry of debt and inheritance, and whether accepting someone else's life's work was honor or just another kind of obligation he'd failed to meet. Cole showed up unannounced on a Tuesday in mid-March, driving a rental car instead of his own truck, because he'd sold the truck to pay rent after the startup collapsed. He looked thinner than Tom remembered from Christmas, carrying the particular exhaustion that came from 6 months of 18-hour days that ended in failure instead of the exit everyone had promised. He stood in the driveway like he wasn't sure whether he was welcome, hands in his pockets against cold that had moderated to the 40s, but still made your breath visible. Tom was feeding the cattle when he saw the rental car pull up. He finished scattering hay and walked over to where his son waited, reading Cole's posture and expression, and understanding before a word was spoken that something had collapsed. Cole's beard had grown in fuller, but his eyes showed the kind of defeat that went deeper than just lost money. The startup failed, Cole said without preamble. Investors pulled funding 6 months in, said the market wasn't ready, said our burn rate was too high, said a dozen things that all meant they didn't believe in us anymore. Tom set down the feed bucket. I'm sorry, son. $250,000. Gone. 6 months of 18-hour days building something I thought would change everything. All the promises I made to the team about equity and success and being part of something big. He looked at Tom with something between anger and desperation. I'm 25 years old, 50,000 in debt from business school, no job, no prospects. I don't know what the hell I'm doing with my life. Tom wanted to offer comfort or advice or some wisdom that would make the failure sting less. Instead, he said the only true thing he could think of. You learned something valuable. That's worth more than money. Cole's expression hardened, jaw tight. How can you say that? You're in debt too. You're barely surviving out here working 2 jobs. What did learning get you that's worth the price? I learned I could fix things I didn't understand if I tried hard enough and asked for help. I learned the difference between building something that lasts and building something on hype that collapses when the funding dries up. I learned to tell the truth about what I didn't know instead of pretending expertise I didn't have. The words landed harder than Tom had intended. Cole turned away, shoulders tight, and Tom recognized his son's pride as the same pride that had nearly killed him multiple times since buying the ranch. The need to prove you could handle everything alone. The belief that asking for help was weakness. The shame that came with failure instead of seeing it as just information about what didn't work. You can stay here, Tom offered. Help with spring planting, figure out your next move. There's work if you want it. I don't want charity from my father. It's not charity, it's family. And the work is real whether you want it or not. Land doesn't care about your feelings or your pride. It just needs doing. Cole stayed, and the first week he worked in silence that was thick enough to taste. They repaired fence line together, replacing posts that had rotted at ground level, stretching new wire tight enough to keep cattle in, but with enough give that temperature swings wouldn't snap it. They prepared equipment for planting, greasing fittings and changing fluids and checking systems that would need to work perfectly when the growing season started. They didn't talk much beyond what the work demanded. Pass me the wire stretcher. Check that post for rot. This section needs 3 more staples. The father-son tension was obvious enough that even Hank noticed. He'd watched them work from the porch, bundled in his coat against cold that wasn't really there, and one evening he pulled Tom aside while Cole was feeding the cattle. Your boy's hurting in ways that don't show, Hank said. Failure hits different when you're young, makes you think it defines you instead of just being information. I know, I'm trying to give him space to figure it out. Space is fine, but guidance is better. Tell him what you learned. Not about ranching, about being broken and having to rebuild yourself from pieces. Tom thought about that conversation while he lay awake that night, thinking about what he'd learned in the 8 months since buying the ranch, about asking for help, about accepting that doing something poorly was better than not doing it at all, about the difference between pride and self-respect. The next morning he and Cole were fixing a gate latch when Tom started talking without planning to. After Sarah died, I spent 3 weeks in motel rooms drinking Jim Beam and trying to figure out why I should keep going. I couldn't answer that question. Still can't really. But I'm here and I'm working, and that's enough most days." Cole looked up from the latch, surprised by the honesty. "The startup failing doesn't mean you failed," Tom continued. "It means you tried something and it didn't work. That's different. I failed at being a good husband, failed at being there when my grandfather needed help, failed at a dozen things that mattered. But I'm learning that failure isn't permanent unless you decide it is." They worked in silence for another few minutes. Then Cole spoke quietly. "I thought success was raising millions and building something that scaled fast and exiting for billions. That's what everyone at Stanford taught us to want. But none of it was real. Just presentations and projections and promises we couldn't keep." "Real is this," Tom said, gesturing at the ranch around them. "Land that you work, animals that depend on you, equipment that breaks and has to be fixed, community that helps when you need it. That's success. Not the money. The building something that lasts." Something shifted in Cole's expression, and the tension between them eased a fraction. Jesse drove up that weekend, and the dynamic changed again. Jesse had a way of mediating without seeming to, keeping conversation light when it threatened to get heavy, focused on problems that had solutions instead of dwelling on ones that didn't. The three of them rebuilt the fence around the back 40, working efficiently as a team, and Cole started asking questions about the operation instead of just following orders. By April, Cole had stopped being resentful and started being curious. He asked why Tom had chosen Timothy and Clover instead of alfalfa, why Angus cattle instead of Herefords, why the planting depth mattered for different crops. Tom answered what he could and admitted when he didn't know, and slowly their relationship shifted from judgment to something closer to partnership. On May 15th, a white Lexus pulled into the driveway, expensive and out of place on gravel that had been washed out by spring runoff and not yet graded smooth. Two men got out, both wearing the kind of business casual that marked them as outsiders. The driver was Walter Gaines, the banker who'd handled the Peterson foreclosure, wearing slacks and a golf shirt and carrying a leather folder. The passenger was maybe 45, suit that probably cost more than Tom's truck, smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Brennan," Gaines called out with false friendliness. "This is David Morrison from Summit Development Corporation. We'd like to talk to you about your property." Tom was replacing porch boards that had rotted through, Cole holding the new lumber in place while Tom drove screws. They both stood up and Tom wiped sawdust from his hands, not offering to shake, not interested in selling. Morrison stepped forward with his folder and the smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "We're prepared to offer $180,000 for your 160 acres. That's over $1,100 per acre, well above current market value for rangeland in this condition. This is a very generous offer, Mr. Brennan." Tom looked at the number on the paper Morrison held out. 180,000 would pay off every debt he had with money left over to start somewhere easier. Somewhere that didn't require 16-hour days and constant fear that one bad season would undo everything. The temptation was real enough to taste. "Not for sale," Tom repeated. Gaines stepped closer, dropping the friendly mask enough to let something harder show through. "You owe money, Tom. Property taxes are due June 1st. That's $3,200. Plus you've got debts to suppliers and probably to Hank Carlson for helping you get started. Can you pay all that?" Tom hesitated, doing math in his head that didn't work. He put everything into seed and supplies for the second-year planting. The snowplow job had ended in March. The cattle wouldn't sell until fall. He had maybe $600 in the bank and over $20,000 in various debts. Didn't think so, Gaines said, satisfaction evident in his voice. We'll wait. When you default on taxes, the county auctions the property. We'll buy it then for half what we're offering now. This is your chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. Morrison added his own pitch, professional and smooth. Mr. Brennan, we're not the bad guys here. We're giving you a way out of a situation that's clearly unsustainable. You're working yourself to death on land that barely produces. Take the money. Start over somewhere that makes sense. After they left, Cole looked at his father with an expression that was hard to read. Dad, that's enough money to clear everything and start fresh. You could buy a smaller place, something manageable. Tom sat down on the porch steps, suddenly tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. This is where I start over. This is the land my grandfather lost. I'm not losing it again to the same kind of people who took it from him. But you can't pay the taxes. You'll lose it anyway. Tom didn't have an answer to that. The math was brutal and simple. He needed $3,200 for taxes by June 1st, another $2,000 for seed, $1,400 for fuel and equipment repairs, operating expenses through October when harvest revenue might come in, total need around $25,000, current funds $600. The gap was impossible to bridge alone. Word spread through the ranching community faster than Tom would have thought possible in an area where neighbors lived 5 miles apart. By May 20th, when Tom drove into Buffalo for supplies, 3 different people stopped him to ask about Summit Development's offer and whether he was selling. One was Merle Hutchins, the 81-year-old who still ranched 500 acres with his son and grandson. Heard Summit made you an offer, Merle said, leaning against Tom's truck in the hardware store parking lot. True. They offered $180 for the 160 acres. I turned them down. Merle's weathered face showed approval. Good. Summit's been buying ranches in Johnson County for 2 years, offering desperate people money they can't refuse, then rezoning for residential and selling to developers for 4 times what they paid. Every ranch they take is one less operation producing food. I can't pay my taxes, though. Might lose it anyway. Merle studied Tom for a long moment. You fought that wildfire alone when everyone else ran. Took in 3 families who lost everything. You're one of us now. We don't let our own fail because of money. 3 days later, Merle called and asked Tom to come to a meeting at the Grange Hall that evening. Tom drove over after dinner, bringing Cole because the invitation had included family. The Grange Hall was a simple metal building that had served as community center for 70 years, hosting everything from wedding receptions to estate auctions to meetings where decisions got made that affected everyone within 50 miles. 40 people were there when Tom arrived. Ranchers he recognized from the fire, families who'd camped in his barn, neighbors who'd helped with the barn raising. Merle Hutchins stood at the front near a folding table covered with coffee and cookies that someone had brought. The room quieted when Tom and Cole walked in. Tom Brennan, Merle said without preamble, his voice carrying authority earned over 8 decades of living. You fought a wildfire alone when everyone with sense evacuated. You took in families who lost everything and asked nothing in return. You're trying to keep land in production instead of selling to developers who will pave it over for houses nobody from here can afford. That makes you one of us. Tom felt his throat tighten but stayed quiet, sensing this was leading somewhere important. Summit Development has been buying ranches for 2 years, Merle continued. They offer cash to people who are struggling. Then they rezone for residential development and flip the properties for massive profit. Every ranch they take is one less family making a living from the land, one less operation producing food, one less piece of our community that stays intact. He paused, looking around the room. We're here to say that pattern stops with Tom's place. What Merle was proposing became clear as 15 ranchers came forward one at a time and handed Tom envelopes. Inside each envelope was cash or a check. Sarah Chen gave $200 and a note that said her husband would have approved. The Henderson family, still rebuilding from the fire, gave $300 they probably couldn't afford. The Yazes contributed $500. Merle himself handed over a check for $1,000. The amounts varied, but the message was uniform. Community takes care of its own. No interest. No timeline. Pay back when you can, or don't pay back at all if that's what it takes to keep Summit from getting another ranch. Tom stood there while they lined up, each person handing him money that totaled $8,600 by the time the last envelope was delivered. Enough to pay property tax, enough to buy seed, enough to bridge the gap until harvest revenue came in. He tried to speak and words failed, tried to thank them and his voice broke. Finally, Merle stepped close and put a gnarled hand on Tom's shoulder. "Say you'll stay, that's payment enough." Tom managed to nod, not trusting himself to speak. "I'll stay, and I'll pay you back every dollar." "We know you will. That's exactly why we're helping." The drive home happened in silence. Cole sat in the passenger seat holding the envelopes, and Tom kept his eyes on the road because if he looked at his son he'd start crying, and he wasn't ready for that. When they pulled into the ranch driveway, Cole finally spoke. "I've never seen anything like that. People just giving money to someone they barely know. They know me well enough. They know I'll work until I die trying to make this place succeed. That's all they need to know." Tom paid the property tax on June 1st with a day to spare. He deposited the remaining community funds in the bank and began planning the second year's planting with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt since before Sarah died. Summit Development's plan, whatever timeline they'd been working toward, had collapsed. Walter Gaines called 3 times over the next week trying to negotiate some version of a sale. Tom didn't return the calls. The land was his, and it was staying his, and no amount of money would change that equation. The second year's planting went better than the first. Tom expanded to 60 acres, planting the same timothy and clover mix that had survived the drought. Spring rains came steady through May and June, soaking deep into soil that had seen almost no moisture the previous year. The hay grew tall and thick, reaching 24 inches by mid-July, and looking like the photographs in farming magazines that made everything seem easier than it was. Cole stayed through summer, finding that he had a talent for the business side that Tom lacked completely. He set up simple bookkeeping on a laptop, tracking expenses and revenue in spreadsheets that actually balanced. He created a website where people could order hay and eggs and eventually beef. He talked about organic certification and direct marketing with the same enthusiasm he'd brought to the failed startup, but this time grounded in actual production instead of projections and promises. Jesse came up every weekend and often stayed through the week, taking a semester off from university to help with expansion. The 3 of them worked as a team, Tom providing muscle and experience gained through mistakes, Cole handling business and planning, Jesse solving mechanical problems that came with running equipment that was 70 years old. The harvest came in early August. 520 bales from 60 acres, each one tight and dry and properly cured. They sold for $6 a bale through the co-op and direct sales. $3,120. Vegetables from the expanded garden brought in $1,800. Eggs from 40 hens added $960. They sold 1 calf early for $800. Total revenue for year 2 was $6,680. Tom sat at the kitchen table with Cole's spreadsheets and tried to feel success. Revenue had increased almost 600% year over year, but expenses had grown too. Seed $2,200, fuel and maintenance $1,400, property tax $3,200, basic living expenses $6,000, total expenses $12,800. Net loss year 2 was $6,120, still losing money, still surviving on debt and community generosity, and the hope that year 3 would be the one where the math finally worked. Cole saw him staring at numbers. We lost money again. Tom nodded, but less than last year, and we're building infrastructure, systems, reputation, things that'll keep producing. How long until we're actually profitable? Cole's projections showed year 3 could break even if weather cooperated. Year 4 might profit. Year 5 could generate enough income for Tom to take an actual salary instead of working county jobs in winter. Long time, Tom admitted. Long enough that we might fail before we succeed. But you're not quitting. Tom looked at his son and saw something that hadn't been there in March. Commitment. Understanding that some things were worth the long fight even when short-term results looked like failure. I'm not quitting. Are you? Cole smiled for the first time in months, genuine warmth breaking through the exhaustion. Not yet. Hank's health declined through summer despite physical therapy and medication, and Tom's careful attention to diet and exercise. The stroke had damaged something fundamental that couldn't be fully repaired. He spent more time in bed, ate less, slept more, talked about the past with the vivid detail of someone whose recent memory was failing but whose distant past remained sharp. On August 19th, Hank asked Tom to drive him to his own ranch, the 640 acres he hadn't seen since the stroke 8 months earlier. They drove over in Tom's truck with Cole following in the rental, winding through gravel roads that Hank had traveled for 53 years. When they reached the property, Hank sat in the truck for a long moment before getting out, just looking at land he'd worked his entire adult life. The house was locked and dark, windows reflecting back the August sun. The barn showed weathering from months of neglect, paint peeling where it had been solid before. The fields lay fallow, grass growing wild where Timothy had been planted in neat rows. Hank walked the property slowly, leaning heavily on Tom's arm, touching fence posts and barn doors and the old windmill that had pumped water for 50 years. He stood in the middle of the main field and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in like he was memorizing something he knew he wouldn't see again. His eyes were wet when he finally spoke. Worked this land for 53 years, built everything you see from nothing, raised cattle and hay and a son who died in Fallujah before he could inherit any of it. His voice caught and he stopped, breathing hard. Thought I'd die here too. Thought I'd keep working until I just fell over one day and that would be it. But I guess you don't always get to choose. They stood in silence while wind moved through grass and clouds built towers on the horizon. Finally, Hank turned to Tom with an expression that was fierce despite the frailty. Take care of it when I'm gone. Don't let it become houses and pavement and people who don't know what land means. Keep it working. That's all that matters in the end. Not the money or the recognition or whether anyone remembers your name. Just keeping the land working. Tom promised and they drove back as the sun set and Hank dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted from the excursion. That night the old man slept deeply and peacefully, and in the morning when Tom checked on him at 7, Hank Carlson was gone. 79 years used up. Heart stopped sometime in the dark hours when death came quiet and simple for men who'd earned rest. The funeral was held August 24th at the Methodist Church in Buffalo, a simple service that filled the building with 300 people who'd known Hank Carlson as neighbor and mentor, and the kind of man you measured yourself against when trying to understand integrity. Tom delivered the eulogy standing at a podium with notes he'd written the night before, and then abandoned because everything he wanted to say felt inadequate. Hank Carlson taught me what my grandfather couldn't, Tom said, his voice carrying to the back where ranchers stood because the pews were full. That land isn't just property, it's legacy. Every fence post you set, every acre you work, Every animal you raise is a promise to the next generation that you'll hand them something better than what you got. Hank kept that promise for 60 years. Now it's my turn. The will reading happened 3 days later in a lawyer's office that smelled like old books and furniture polish. Miller and Associates had been Hank's attorneys for 40 years. The senior partner read the document in a voice that suggested he'd expected the contents to surprise people. Tom sat with Cole and Jesse, not sure why they'd been asked to attend. To Thomas James Brennan, the lawyer read, "I leave my entire ranch of 640 acres including all buildings, equipment, water rights, and livestock, with the following conditions. The property must remain in active agricultural use for a minimum of 10 years from date of transfer. If sold or converted to non-agricultural use before that time, ownership transfers to the Wyoming Agricultural Land Trust." Tom felt the words hit like physical force. 640 acres, everything Hank had built, left to a man who'd known him less than 2 years. When the reading finished, the lawyer handed Tom a sealed envelope with his name in Hank's careful handwriting. Tom opened it with hands that shook. "Tom, you asked me once why I chose you. The answer is simple. James trusted me with his truth and his friendship for 30 years. You're his blood and his legacy. This land should have been his to pass to you. The bank stole that chance in 1986. I'm giving it back the only way I know how. Don't fail him. Don't fail yourself. Don't fail the promise we make when we work land instead of just owning it. Keep it working. Hank." Tom sat in the parking lot for an hour after everyone else left, holding that letter and trying to understand. He owned 800 acres now, property worth $500,000, more land than his grandfather had ever owned, and obligations that would require the next decade to fulfill. Fall came to Wyoming in September 2024 with frost that turned the grass silver in the mornings and left patterns on the truck windows that looked like ferns growing in ice. Tom Brennan stood at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, looking at 800 acres of responsibility spread across 2 properties that he'd somehow ended up owning through a combination of desperation and luck, and the generosity of men who'd believed in him more than he believed in himself. The inheritance from Hank had changed everything and nothing. Changed in that Tom now controlled enough land to build a genuinely sustainable operation. Changed in that he had collateral that banks would actually lend against. Changed in that the pressure to succeed had multiplied because he was carrying Hank's legacy along with his grandfather's. But nothing had changed in the daily reality. The work still needed doing. The cattle still needed feeding. The equipment still broke and had to be fixed. Debt still accumulated faster than revenue came in. Cole was still there. He'd never left after the startup failed, never gone back to California to chase another idea that might turn into funding. Instead, he'd stayed through summer and into fall, his hands developing calluses in places that business school had never prepared him for, his back learning to tolerate labor that left you sore in ways you didn't know were possible. One evening in late September, they were fixing fence on what had been Hank's back 40 when Cole stopped working and looked at Tom with an expression that suggested a decision had solidified. "I want to stay," Cole said, tamping dirt around a new fence post. "Not just for another season. Full time, make this my career." Tom held the post steady while Cole worked. "You had a Stanford MBA. You could get another startup funded. Try again in tech. Move to San Francisco or Austin or wherever the smart money is flowing this year." "I don't want that anymore." Cole straightened up and gestured at the land around them, at cattle grazing in the distance, at the barn that had been saved and the house that was slowly becoming solid. Silicon Valley is people chasing money and calling it innovation, raising funds and burning through them and hoping to exit before everything collapses. This is actual building, something that lasts, something that matters. Tom felt something shift in his chest, pride mixed with concern about whether he was doing his son any favors by letting him commit to a life that was mostly hard work and small margins. "You sure about this? Ranching doesn't get easier. It gets harder as your body stops cooperating, and the weather keeps doing whatever it wants regardless of your plans." "I'm sure." Cole's voice was steady, certain in a way it hadn't been since before the startup failed. "I thought success was raising venture capital and building something that scales fast and exits for billions. I was wrong. Success is this: owning something real, working with your hands, building slowly, sleeping well because you earned it." They finished the fence in silence and drove back to the ranch house where Jesse was waiting with his own news. He'd taken a year off from university, and now he was ready to make it permanent. He wanted to invest his savings in the operation as a junior partner, $12,000 accumulated from 4 years of working as a mechanic, money his grandfather Roberto had taught him to save because land was the only asset worth fighting for. Jesse proposed a partnership structure that Cole helped formalize on his laptop. Tom would retain majority ownership at 60% for providing the land and bearing the initial risk. Cole would get 25% for sweat equity and taking on management of business operations. Jesse would receive 15% for his capital investment and mechanical expertise. No exit strategy. No timeline for buyout. Just 3 men betting their futures on 800 acres of Wyoming rangeland, and the belief that land worked properly would provide. They signed the partnership agreement on October 15th in Merle Hutchins' presence, the old rancher serving as witness, because he'd lived long enough to see partnerships succeed and fail, and he told them the ones that lasted were built on clear expectations and written terms. The handshake mattered, but the paperwork mattered more when disagreements arose about who owed what to whom. Winter planning started that November around the kitchen table with Cole's spreadsheets and Jesse's maintenance logs and topographic maps of both properties spread out like battle plans. 120 acres of hay instead of 60. 30 head of cattle instead of 6, building a breeding program that would generate steady income instead of relying on volatile market sales. Vegetables and eggs scaled up enough to supply 50 families instead of 20. Equipment purchases they couldn't quite afford but needed desperately. Cole built a professional website taking photographs that told the story people wanted to hear. Third-generation ranch. Grandfather lost it to foreclosure in 1986. Grandson reclaimed it 2023. Building something meant to last. Sustainable practices. Family operated. Every bag of feed or dozen eggs came with a card explaining the history, connecting customers to land and legacy in ways that made them willing to pay premium prices for products they could get cheaper at grocery stores. Orders started coming from people who'd never set foot in Wyoming, customers who wanted to support small operations that treated land and animals with respect, instead of extracting maximum profit at minimum cost. The vegetable stand evolved into a weekly farmers market that drew families from Buffalo and Sheridan, and even Casper, people making 2-hour drives to buy food from producers they could shake hands with and trust. Spring 2025 brought weather that cooperated in ways Wyoming weather rarely did. Rain fell steady through April and May, soaking deep into soil that held moisture instead of shedding it into runoff. Temperatures stayed moderate, no late freezes to kill seedlings, no early heat waves to stress crops before they'd established. The hay grew thick and tall, timothy and clover mix reaching 30 inches by mid-June, and looking like something from agricultural college demonstrations, instead of a third-year operation learning through mistakes. Tom taught Cole everything Hank had taught him about timing and depth, and the 1,000 small decisions that separated good harvests from failed ones. Cole learned fast, asking questions until he understood the why behind every action, taking notes in a composition book the same way Tom had when Hank was mentoring him. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Knowledge passing down through generations, each man teaching the next what he'd learned through trial and error, and the patient guidance of someone who'd walked the path before. Jesse maintained equipment with attention that made machines last beyond their design specifications. The Alley's Chalmers WD got a complete engine rebuild that winter, Jesse taking it down to bare block and rebuilding with precision that bordered on reverence. New rings and bearings, gaskets replaced, every seal checked. The magneto rewound by a specialist in Montana who still worked on equipment from the 1950s. When they fired up the tractor in April, it ran smoother than it had since coming off the assembly line 71 years earlier. The third-year harvest brought 980 bales from 120 acres. They sold for $6.50 each through the co-op and direct sales, generating $6,370. The cattle operation had grown to 30 head including breeding stock, and they sold 12 calves at $850 each for $10,200. Vegetables and eggs brought in $4,800 through the farmers market and website orders. Total revenue for year 3 was $21,370. Tom sat with Cole's spreadsheet on the laptop and looked at numbers that should have felt like victory. Seed and fertilizer $4,200, fuel and equipment maintenance $2,800, property taxes for both properties $6,400, hired help for harvest $1,200, insurance, veterinary, miscellaneous costs that added up to $14,200 total expenses. Net profit for year 3 was $7,170, the first year showing black ink instead of red. Actual money left over after paying for everything required to keep the operation running. Tom printed the spreadsheet and taped it to the refrigerator like a trophy, proof that persistence and patience, and refusing to quit when smart people would have walked away, had finally started paying in currency that banks recognized. Cole stood looking at the numbers and shook his head in wonder. "We did it, Dad. 3 years and we're actually making money." Tom studied the math. 7,000 profit split 3 ways meant each partner earned about $2,400 for a year's work. That worked out to maybe $2 an hour if you counted all the time they'd actually invested. But the trajectory was up. Cole's projections showed year 4 hitting $12,000 in profit if nothing went catastrophically wrong. Year 5 could reach $18,000. By year 6, they might generate enough income for Tom to draw an actual salary that approached minimum wage. They started paying back the community loans in $50 and $100 increments, returning money to the ranchers who'd pooled resources to save Tom from Summit Development. Merle Hutchins refused his payment 3 times before finally accepting it with the condition that Tom pay it forward when someone else needed help. By late summer 2025, they repaid $4,600 of the $8,600 borrowed, and Tom made a plan to clear the rest by the following spring. News came through the ranching network in March 2025 that Walter Gaines had been arrested by the FBI. Federal charges related to fraud in Carbon County, nothing directly connected to Johnson County or Summit Development, but enough to trigger investigations into all his business dealings. Summit Development Corporation pulled out of Wyoming entirely 3 months later, their business model exposed as borderline legal at best, and their reputation destroyed in communities that took a dim view of outsiders profiting from desperation. The ranches that Summit had tried to buy stayed in production. The families that had been offered money they couldn't refuse had refused anyway, choosing hard work and uncertain futures over cash that came with the cost of watching their land turn into subdivisions. Tom heard through Merle that 6 ranching families had formed a cooperative to share equipment and labor, inspired by the community response that had saved Tom's operation. What had started as saving one man's ranch had grown into something larger, a pushback against corporate consolidation that had been quietly devouring rural communities for decades. Cole changed through 2025 in ways that went deeper than just learning mechanical skills or business practices. He stopped talking about disruption and scale and growth metrics, the vocabulary of tech startups that measured success in user acquisition instead of actual production. He started talking about soil health and rotational grazing and perennial polycultures with the intensity he'd once brought to pitch decks. At 27, he was younger than Tom had been when he bought the ranch, but he'd figured out something it had taken Tom until 58 to understand. Building something real meant accepting that results came slow, and the work never ended and success looked like incremental improvement over decades instead of hockey stick growth over quarters. One evening, in June 2025, they sat on the porch after a day of fence repair that had left them both exhausted. Cole had a beer and Tom had coffee, and they watched the sun set over fields that were green and productive, and theirs in a way that felt earned through labor instead of just purchased with money. "I thought success was Silicon Valley money," Cole said quietly, "raising millions, building something that could exit for billions, making the Forbes 30 under 30 list, getting interviewed about how we disrupted some industry." He paused, drinking beer and watching cattle graze in the distance. "I was completely wrong about what mattered." Tom looked at his son and saw someone who'd learned from failure instead of being destroyed by it. "Took me 58 years to figure out what actually matters. You got there at 27. You're considerably smarter than your old man. Just had a better teacher. And I failed spectacularly enough that I couldn't lie to myself anymore about what I was chasing." They sat in comfortable silence until dark settled over the ranch and stars emerged in numbers that still surprised Tom even after 2 years of Wyoming nights. Inside the house, Jesse was cooking dinner and arguing with someone on the phone about transmission parts for the truck they'd bought used to handle supply runs. This was family now, not the one Tom had been born into or the one he'd built with Sarah, but a different kind, chosen instead of given. Built on shared work and mutual respect, and the understanding that some things mattered more than blood. The Allie's Chalmers WD turned 70 years old in June 2025, exactly 71 years since it had rolled off the assembly line in West Allies, Wisconsin in 1954. Tom and Jesse had spent the previous winter doing a restoration that went beyond mechanical necessity and approached something closer to art. They'd taken the tractor down to bare frame, cataloging every part, measuring every dimension, documenting the process with photographs that Jesse archived on his laptop. New paint in proper Allie's orange, the exact shade that had been applied in 1954. Chrome parts replated by a specialist in Nebraska who understood that perfection mattered when you were restoring history. The engine rebuilt to factory specifications, using original style parts that Jesse sourced from collectors and salvage yards and online forums where people traded components for machines that had been out of production since before Tom was born. Every system checked and tested, and brought to a condition that matched or exceeded how it had left the factory 71 years earlier. Jesse found a vintage tractor show in Sheridan that happened every June, bringing together enthusiasts from across Wyoming and Montana and the western Dakotas. They trailered the Alleys over on a Saturday morning, arriving early to claim a good display spot among 200 other machines ranging from ancient steam tractors to pristine John Deere models from the 1960s. Tom set up a folding chair beside the tractor and waited for people to come ask questions. They came in steady streams throughout the morning. Old farmers who remembered working on Allie's Chalmers tractors in their youth, young enthusiasts who'd never seen one in person, families teaching their kids about agricultural history. Tom told the story of finding the tractor buried under 8 years of dust and bird droppings, of his grandfather buying it new in 1954, of the journal hidden in the seat that had led him back to land his family had lost 40 years earlier. People listened with the kind of attention that suggested they understood what he was really talking about, which wasn't machinery but legacy, and the threads that connected generations across time. The judges came through in the afternoon with clipboards and scoring sheets, and the serious expressions of people who took vintage tractor restoration as seriously as others took fine art. They examined every detail, asked questions about originality versus replacement parts, checked serial numbers against factory records that one judge had brought on his tablet. They made notes and moved on to the next entry, and Tom went back to talking with visitors who wanted to know how a 71-year-old tractor could look so perfect. When they announced awards at day's end, Tom was surprised to hear his name called for Best Restoration. He walked to the podium with Cole and Jesse, accepting a trophy that was mostly plastic but somehow felt heavier than it should have. The head judge asked if he wanted to say a few words about what made this particular tractor special. Tom looked out at the crowd of farmers and ranchers and enthusiasts who understood that machines carried stories beyond their mechanical function. He thought about his grandfather buying this tractor new in 1954, working it for 3 decades before the bank took everything, about finding it dead in a shed and bringing it back to life with help from his son and Jesse, about what it meant to fix broken things instead of replacing them with new models that would fail just as surely. My grandfather bought this tractor brand new in 1954, Tom said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. Worked it for 31 years before the bank foreclosed and took his ranch. It sat dead in a shed for 8 years after that. I found it when I bought the ranch at auction 2 years ago. Brought it back because my grandfather couldn't. He paused, feeling emotion rise in his throat. It's 71 years old and still running, still working. Still proving that things built right and maintained with care can outlast the people who built them. Kind of like me. Broke down, left for dead, but somebody believed I was worth fixing. The crowd applauded, and Tom walked back to where Cole and Jesse waited, both of them looking proud enough to embarrass him if he let himself think about it too much. They loaded the alleys onto the trailer and drove home with the trophy rattling in the cup holder, and Tom felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as satisfaction. Not happiness exactly, which was too fragile and temporary. Something more durable. The sense that he was exactly, or he needed to be doing exactly what he was meant to do. In late summer 2025, Tom was hiking the back section of what had been Hank's ranch, checking fence line, and looking for places where cattle might have pushed through during the heat when they'd been seeking shade. He found a collapsed line shack he hadn't noticed before, half buried in brush and sagebrush, the roof caved in but 3 walls still standing. Curiosity pulled him inside where daylight filtered through gaps and showed debris scattered across the dirt floor. Most of it was worthless. Rusted cans, rotted fabric, pieces of equipment too corroded to identify. But in the corner, protected by an overhang that had kept the worst of the rain out, Tom found a metal ammunition box painted olive drab and sealed with a latch that had rusted shut. He pried it open with his pocket knife and found papers inside, letters written in handwriting he recognized from the journal hidden in the tractor seat. His grandfather's letters, written but never sent, addressed to Tom, dated from 1985 and 1986, the years when Tom had been deployed for the first time and James, Brennan, had been losing the ranch to foreclosure. Tom sat on the floor of the collapsed line shack and read them one by one, his grandfather's voice reaching across 40 years with words that had been meant to explain and apologize and somehow make sense of failure. Tom, I'm losing the ranch. Bank says I owe $18,000 by end of year. I can't pay. 3 years of drought broke me. Cattle market collapsed. I borrowed against everything and it still wasn't enough. You were supposed to inherit this place. supposed to come back from the army and ranch it yourself. Instead, I'm handing you nothing but news that your grandfather failed. Tom, I want you to understand the land wasn't given away easily. I fought for 3 years to keep it, sold every piece of equipment that wasn't essential, borrowed from everyone who'd lend, cut expenses until there was nothing left to cut, worked 18-hour days trying to make the numbers work. But drought doesn't care how hard you work. Banks don't care that you did everything right. The math didn't work, and $18,000 might as well have been $18 million. Tom, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and somehow these letters found their way to you. I left them here because I couldn't mail them. Couldn't bear to tell you while you were deployed that everything I'd built was gone. Couldn't add that burden to what you were already carrying. But I need you to know something. I didn't give up. The bank took it from me. There's a difference. I worked this land for 31 years and I'd have worked it 30 more if they'd let me. You were serving your country and I'm proud of you for that. Don't blame yourself for not being here. Don't think any of this was your fault. You did what you needed to do. Tom sat in the ruins reading letters his grandfather had written but never sent, understanding finally what Hank had been trying to tell him in the hospital. That his grandfather hadn't failed as a man or a rancher. That the system had beaten him through circumstances beyond any individual's control. That drought and market crashes and bank policies crushed men who did everything right. And the shame of foreclosure belonged to institutions that prioritized profit over people, not to farmers who'd poured their lives into land that was taken from them anyway. He gathered the letters carefully and walked back to his truck, driving home through afternoon light that turned the prairie gold. That evening, he built a fire in the burn barrel behind the house and fed the letters into flames one by one, watching his grandfather's words turn to ash and smoke that rose into Wyoming sky. It felt like ritual, like releasing debt that had been carried for 40 years by a man who no longer needed to carry it. Like finally completing the circle that had started when James Brennan bought this land in 1953 and lost it in 1986, and Tom reclaimed it in 2023. Grandpa, Tom said to the smoke and the gathering darkness, I'm home. I brought your tractor back. I brought your land back. I kept the promises you couldn't keep. We're even now. The smoke climbed higher and dispersed into evening air, and Tom stood there until the fire burned down to embers. Then he went inside where Cole was cooking dinner, and Jesse was rebuilding a carburetor on the kitchen table, and life continued in the way it did when you'd made peace with the past and could focus entirely on building a future. The years between 2025 and 2026 passed in the rhythm that ranching imposed on everyone who chose it over easier options. Planting and harvest, breeding season and calving, fence repair that never truly ended, equipment maintenance that was constant. The work never stopped, but it became predictable enough to manage, routine enough that Tom's hands rarely shook anymore unless he was exhausted or stressed beyond his normal capacity to handle pressure. Year 4 brought revenue of $32,000 with expenses of $20,000, netting $12,000 in profit that they split according to partnership percentages. Tom finally drew a salary, $2,400 for the year, which worked out to $2 an hour if you counted all the time invested, but felt like wealth compared to the nothing he'd had 3 years earlier. Year 5 pushed revenue to $45,000 with expenses holding steady at $23,000, leaving $22,000 in profit. Tom's salary increased to $6,400, enough to live on if you kept expenses minimal and didn't expect luxuries like new clothes or eating out or any of the things normal people took for granted. But he owned 800 acres free and clear, had a partner in his son who'd found purpose, had Jesse's mechanical genius keeping equipment running, had community respect earned through staying when leaving would have been easier. By June 2026, Tom Brennan was 61 years old. His back hurt most mornings in ways that no amount of stretching fixed. His hands were permanently stained from oil and dirt, and the accumulated residue of fixing things that broke constantly. But he was debt-free. The ranch was profitable. The cattle operation had grown to 45 head. The Alley's Chalmers WD had turned 72 and was running stronger than tractors half its age. They stood in a hayfield on a June morning, 3 men separated by a generation, but connected by the choice to work land that most people had written off as marginal at best. The hay was ready for cutting, standing tall and thick, 32 inches of timothy and clover that would yield maybe 1,200 bales from 120 acres. The Alleys sat nearby, 72 years old, orange paint bright in early sun, ready for another season of work. Cole was checking the baler when he stopped and looked at the tractor. "You think this thing will make it to 100 years old?" Tom walked over and ran his hand along the hood, feeling metal that had been shaped in 1954 and had somehow survived to 2026 through the care of men who understood that machines lasted longer than people when you treated them right. "If we take care of her." Nothing lasts forever, but this tractor was built better than anything they make now. No computers to fail. No emission systems to clog. Just simple machinery that works if you maintain it properly. "What about the land?" Jesse asked, joining them. "Think we can keep it another 72 years?" Tom looked at his son and saw someone ready to carry the burden forward, someone who'd learned through failure and hard work that legacy wasn't about what you accumulated but what you passed on in better shape than you received it. "We don't keep land," he said quietly. "We borrow it from the future. Your job, Cole, is to hand it to the next generation in better shape than you got it. Same with this tractor. We're just borrowing it from whoever comes after us." They stood in silence for a moment, 3 men in a hayfield at the beginning of a season that would require everything they had and then ask for more. Around them, 800 acres of Wyoming rangeland stretched toward mountains that had stood longer than human memory and would stand long after everyone present was gone. The Alleys rumbled steady and reliable, proof that things built right and maintained with care could outlast the people who built them and the circumstances that tried to break them. Tom climbed onto the tractor seat, leather worn smooth from 72 years of use, and started toward the hay that needed cutting. Behind him, Cole and Jesse followed with equipment, and together they worked through the morning cutting and baling, and doing the same work that had been done on this land since James Brennan homesteaded it in 1953. Work that would continue long after Tom was gone, carried forward by men who understood that some things mattered more than profit. That legacy was built in generations instead of quarters. That land outlasted everyone if you just took care of it properly. By evening they'd cut 20 acres and the hay lay in windows drying in the sun, ready for baling the next day. They loaded equipment and drove back to the ranch house where dinner was waiting, and the barn stood solid and fields stretched green in all directions. Tom parked the Alleys in the equipment shed and shut it down, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. 72 years of accumulated work settling into silence. Tomorrow they'd start again. The cycle would continue. The land would demand attention and labor and absolute commitment. But tonight, Tom Brennan stood on the porch of a house his grandfather had built and lost, and Tom had reclaimed, looking out at 800 acres that belonged to him and his son and their partner. Land that had been lost and reclaimed and would be passed forward, carrying the weight of 3 generations of men who'd refused to quit when quitting was the sensible option. The sky turned purple, then black, and stars emerged in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia and would guide them for millennia more. Somewhere a coyote called and cattle lowed in the distance, and wind moved through grass the way it had moved for 10,000 years before humans arrived, and would move for 10,000 more after they were gone. Tom stood in that ancient rhythm and felt connected to something larger than his own small life, part of a chain of work and care and stubborn persistence that stretched back to the first farmer who'd ever put seed in ground and forward to descendants he'd never meet, but who would benefit from choices he made today. He went inside where his family waited and closed the door on another day of work that had brought them one step closer to sustainable and maybe even successful if you measured success in continuity instead of profit margins. The alley sat quiet in the shed. The land rested under stars. And Tom Brennan, 61 years old, former tank mechanic and current rancher, fell asleep knowing he'd kept every promise he'd made to men who weren't alive to see whether he'd followed through. That was enough. That would always be enough.